G'day, mate. 40 here. So, why did all the cable networks cut away from the press secretary's news conference today after just about 30 seconds of showing footage of Antifa and the Portland riots, footage taken by Andy No? Well, I have an explanation, but first, let's go to the video.
Trump administration will not stand by and allow anarchy in our streets. Law and order will prevail, and I have a short video for you because I want it to be real what is happening right now in Portland. So if we could play that video, that'd be great.
I hope someone kills your whole family.
That wasn't me, Holly.
I hope they kill you too. I hope someone burns down your whole precinct with all y'all inside. Can't wait to see it.
As you can see, that is anything but a peaceful protest. And
all right, we were not expecting that video, and our management here at Fox News has decided we will pull away from that at this time. I want to.
Okay, so you might think, oh, Fox, they're just so prissy. Why won't they tell you the truth? The elites have co-opted everybody. How are ordinary people going to get the truth? But the story is not that. Okay, the story is that networks have standards. Fox News has standards, and so they don't like profanity. An article here on Politico. Fox News live against White House. Harris Faulkner broke away from news briefing after White House press secretary Kayleigh McEnany. She's married with kids, guys. Played a video of protesters in Portland, Oregon, toppling statues and yelling obscenities at police officers. The video showed a toppled statue with the words F cops plainly visible. Also showed a protester telling police officer, hope someone kills your whole effing family, with an apparent profanity silenced out. Oh, man. Still got mic problems. Damn. Okay.
Representative Yoho to apologize to me. Clearly, he does not want to. Clearly, when given the opportunity, he will not. And I will not stay up late at night waiting for an apology from a man who has no remorse over calling women and using abusive language towards women. But what I do have issue with is using women, our wives, and daughters as shields and excuses for poor behavior. Mr. Yoho mentioned that he has a wife and 2 daughters. I am 2 years younger than Mr. Yoho's youngest daughter. I am someone's daughter, too. My father, thankfully, is not alive to see how Mr. Yoho treated his daughter. My mother got to see Mr. Yoho's disrespect on the floor of this house towards me on television. And I am here because I have to show my parents that I am their daughter and that they did not raise me to accept abuse from men.
Scott Greer tweets, liberal women demand to be treated as equals, yet they also demand to cling to Victorian standards when men talk to them as equals. So which is it? Are they equals or are they not? Fox News report. So we were not expecting that video. Our management here at Fox News has decided we pull away from that at this time, Harris Faulkner said. Some tough images there, a lot of things that we didn't anticipate shown in terms of some wording on the screen. guidelines notably prohibit profanity between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. on television, and there is a reasonable risk that children may be in the audience. Because Fox News is a cable service, it is exempt from the profanity law. The cable news station's internal policies are swear. Fox News contributors were suspended for using profanity on air in 2015. CNN and MSNBC did not air the news briefing live. And then Harris Faulkner returned to airing the briefing once Kayleigh McEnany started taking questions from the press corps. At the end of the hour, Faulkner said the network had not been aware that McEnany planned to show that video. So that's why you had the networks just cutting away. Man, still having problems with my audio.
And it's really a pleasure to have him. And Dr. Zakheim, Vakasha, it's all yours.
Thank you. And this runs for an hour, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you for those of you who are tuning in. I want to dedicate this to the memory of my father, Zatzal, who today is his yahrzeit. And in many ways, I got interested in public service because he was a public servant. When he was a young man, still in Europe, he was the legal counsel of the Jewish community in Lithuania, and also actually was the secretary to Reb Chaim Moshe Grodzinski, who at the time was the Gadol Ador. And so that was the example to me of sort of both serving your country and serving your God in inverse order, I should say. I really should start with a law that was initiated by Congressman Stephen Solars in the 1970s. He was a congressman from Brooklyn. He had actually gone to Yeshiva Flatbush. He's no longer with this world. He got a law passed that if you didn't work certain hours on a Friday and certainly on a Saturday in the government, you could make it up with what was called comp time. Now, what that did was open up federal government work to Orthodox Jews. You could also, all of a sudden, you could leave on Friday early. You didn't have to worry. You'd come in Sunday and you'd make it up, which in fact I did when I joined the Congressional Budget Office in 1975. I made it clear to the person who hired me that I didn't work on Saturdays. It wasn't a problem. I just would come in Sunday. Sometimes there were other people who came in on Sunday anyway. There were always workaholics. So I wasn't necessarily alone. While I was at the budget office, I was certainly not a very senior person in government, but everybody not only knew that I was Jewish, some people knew that I happened to have smicha. How it got out wasn't necessarily me. I don't call myself rabbi. But I recall one time I was in Denmark, and I'm talking to a general there. I was in the military side of things in what was called the National Security Division of the Budget Office. And I mentioned to him that, how wonderful it was that the Jews of Denmark had been saved in World War II. Remember, this is 75. It's not all that long after the war ended, 3 decades. When you're my age, 3 decades is nothing. And he basically poo-pooed it. It was like, so what's the big deal? As if to say, what else should we have done? I found that very, very interesting. And I found that in many ways, Scandinavians, leaving the Norwegians aside, because Quisling, that was a whole other problem, there were interesting stories that would come out of Scandinavia. And so I'll tell you one that'll, as they say, blow your mind. I had a friend, young diplomat from Finland named Rene Nibra. And he's still a friend. He is now Finland's leading expert on Russia. And since the Finns have fought the Russians and they're next door to the Russians, they understand the Russians probably better than anyone. Rene told me this unbelievable story. Marshal Mannerheim, who was the dictator of Finland, was allied to Germany, to Nazi Germany, because the Finns had fought the Winter War with the Soviets, and anybody who hated the Soviets was their friend. Hitler asked Mannerheim to turn the Jews over. Mannerheim absolutely refused. Not only that, there were Jewish officers in the Finnish army who commanded Nazi troops. And there were Jewish doctors in the Finnish army who got the Nazi Iron Cross for saving Nazi soldiers. The world is truly a crazy place. And because people knew that I was Jewish and openly Jewish, I would hear these stories from people over and over again. When I went to the Pentagon in 1981, I had studied in England, and I repaid the British in spades because when the Falkland Islands were invaded, I came into the office on Monday and told my boss, what are we doing about it? They were invaded on a Friday, and all Shabbos and all Sunday, that's all I heard about how terrible the Argentines were that they had invaded the Falkland Islands. And my boss said to me, why do you care? And I said, if you were home this weekend, and my boss was Jewish, I said, if you were home over Shabbos, you would have cared too. Well, working on the Falkland Islands, there was, of course, a question of what do I do on Shabbos? Wars don't stop on Shabbos. The only wartime activity I'm aware of that stopped on Shabbos is Josephus writes.
Okay, I'll get back to that, but that gentleman is Dov Zakheim. He has a PhD from Oxford, and he's also a systems analyst. He had very high up positions in the Pentagon under George H.W. Bush and then under George W. Bush. And so he's also, as you can see, an Orthodox Jew. Okay, so I want to tackle this Tucker Carlson story where he claims that the New York Times wants to dox him.
One more thing before we go tonight. Since this show began almost 4 years ago, I've really tried not to talk about myself on the air or even use the first person pronoun. The last thing this country needs is more narcissism. It's not very interesting anyway. People who use the word I a lot tend to bore everyone but themselves. But tonight we're going to make an exception to that rule. We don't have much choice. Last week, the New York Times began working on a story about where my family and I live. As a matter of journalism, there is no conceivable justification for a story like that. The paper is not alleging we've done anything wrong, and we haven't. We pay our taxes, we like our neighbors, we've never had a dispute with anyone. So why is the New York Times doing a story on the location of my family's house? Well, you know why. To hurt us. To injure my wife and kids so that I will shut up and stop disagreeing with them. They believe in force. We've learned that. 2 years ago, a left-wing journalist publicized our home address in Washington. A group of screaming Antifa lunatics showed up while I was at work. They vandalized our home. They threatened my wife. She called 911 while hiding in a closet. A few weeks later, they showed up again at our house. For the next year, they sent letters to our home threatening to kill us. We tried to ignore it. It felt cowardly to sell our home and leave. We'd raised our kids there in the neighborhood, and we loved it. But in the end, that's what we did. We have 4 children. It just wasn't worth it. But the New York Times followed us. The paper has assigned a political activist called Murray Carpenter to write a story about where we are now. They've hired a photographer called Tristan Spinsky to take pictures. Their story about where we live is slated to run in the paper this week. Editors there know exactly what will happen to my family when it does run. I called them today and I told them, but they didn't care. They hate my politics. They want this show off the air. If one of my children gets hurt because of a story they wrote, they won't consider it collateral damage. They know it's the whole point of the exercise, to inflict pain on our family, to terrorize us, to control what we say. That's the kind of people they are. They'll deny this, of course. They'll claim it's just journalism, just the facts. Really? So how would Murray Carpenter and his photographer Tristan Spinsky feel if we told you where they live, if we put pictures of their homes on the air? What if we publicized the home address of every one of the soulless robot editors at the New York Times who assigned and managed this incitement to violence against my family? What about the media editor, Jim Windolf? We could do that. We know who they are. Would that qualify as journalism? We doubt they'd consider it journalism. They'd call it criminal behavior if we did it. And that tells you everything.
Okay, so Tucker is great at eliciting outrage. Who is not outraged when you listen to that report by Tucker Carlson? So is he being accurate or is he being histrionic? And so this is another example of how I think we need to listen to our critics. So most everyone who watches this show enjoys Tucker, likes Tucker, wants to support Tucker. But let's hear a contrary point of view from the Washington Post left-wing media columnist. And he, I think, makes some important points. And when I listen to Tucker and then when I listen to Eric Wemple, I think that Eric Wemple, the left-wing dude, is more accurate. So his story in the Washington Post, Maine journalists under siege after false accusations from Fox News' Tucker Carlson. 2 freelance journalists in Maine have sustained abuse and threats after being named by Fox News host Tucker Carlson on Monday night as part of an effort by the New York Times to do a story on the location of my family's house, right? When you hear what Tucker has to say, it just sounds horrible. But I'm not aware of the New York Times ever doxing people. The New York Times, love them or hate them, their journalists tend to have about the highest ethical standards of any publication around. On which publications are the ethical and journalistic standards higher than at the New York Times? Carlson disclosed that the newspaper had followed him after he and his family left their Washington home on account of protesters and threatening letters. Last week, the New York Times began working on a story about where my family and I live. As a matter of journalism, there is no conceivable justification for a story like that, said the host, who summers in Maine and tapes his program from a remote studio in the state. The paper is not alleging we've done anything wrong. We haven't. We pay our taxes. We like our neighbors. We've never had a dispute with anyone. He then proceeded to name the journalist working on the story, Murray Carpenter, who's based in Maine, who's filed stories for the Washington Post magazine, NPR, The Times, and others, and Maine-based photographer Tristan Spinsky. And Tucker alleges that this Murray Carpenter is not a journalist, he's just an activist. So Tucker's complaint about this pending story allegedly disclosing his location had precisely that effect on Murray Carpenter, whose home address was posted online following the segment. That intrusion was merely the beginning. The photographer Spinsky alleges that about an hour after the Tucker Carlson accusation, someone attempted to break into his main home while he and his wife were present. It was like a booming sound, someone trying to get in, says Spinsky. Our doors, up until that segment aired, had actually been unlocked. When the segment aired, everything got locked. I'm glad it did, because within an hour, someone was here. We put ourselves in the safest place we could, away from the windows, called the police, and waited it out. Murray Carpenter says he's received thousands of emails stemming from Tucker Carlson's Monday night monologue, most of which were some mixture of abusive, threatening, and hateful. Family members received direct threats as well. This episode is remarkable for 4 reasons, writes Eric Wemple. Tucker Carlson was inveighing against a story that wasn't even close to publication. As the photographer tells Eric Wemple, he was planning to visit the town in which Tucker Carlson films his show on Tuesday morning, a day after Carlson's segment, so Spinsky hadn't photographed anything yet. Story would be about this community, this small rural community in Maine. It's very small, very rural, and very kind of Americana, and happens to be the location of this massively popular cable news show. Tucker managed to convince his audience that the Carpenter-Spinsky duo would dox him. While he knew there was no such plan, though the host said that the Times would focus on the location of his home, he suggested something more concrete with his accusations against the 2 freelancers. So how would Murray Carpenter and his photographer Tristan Spinsky feel if we told you where they live, if we put pictures of their homes on the air? What if we publicized the home address of every one of the soulless robot editors of the New York Times who assigned and managed this incitement to violence against my family? Sources at the New York Times, however, insist that assurances were made to Fox News in at least 2 separate conversations that the newspaper wouldn't either publish Tucker Carlson's address or photograph his home. Those assurances were delivered before Monday night's segment on Tucker Carlson Tonight. A directive on Monday afternoon from a Times editor instructed Spinsky and Carpenter not to photograph the residents. There was even a pledge that the story wouldn't publish certain details about Tucker Carlson's setup that had already been made public elsewhere, that had already been published elsewhere. GQ and media outlets in Maine had reported many details about Tucker Carlson's love of the Oxford County town, where he has spent just about all his summers. That reporting includes the story of his purchase of an Oxford County garage located down the road from his residence to house his summertime Tucker Carlson Tonight show. So we've got Rodney Martin back with us on the show. What's going on, Rodney? Rodney, can you hear me? Okay, I wonder why Rodney can't hear me. Let me check the settings. Okay. It's on my end. Okay, Rodney, what's going on, man?
Hey, Luke. I was just listening to, does my sound okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, I was just listening about this Tucker Carlson story, and I watched him the night that he gave this spiel about being doxxed, and then I just listened to the rejoinder that was from the New York Times, I suppose, and say that I believe that the article that you just read, the New York Times rejoinder, is classic yellow journalism crying out in pain as they try to strike you. Now, if they wanted to do a news story on just a simple Americana town, why not Hutchinson, Kansas? Why not Dodge City, by the way, which was the subject of the longest running Western drama in television history, Gunsmoke, which is now a majority minority town. Why not? That's Americana under the journalists, these leftist journalist definition. Why not go and do a story on Flagstaff, Arizona? I mean, I could name, probably 100 small town, all Americana cities why this is just their attempt to say, oh no, our focus is on the town. Oh, and by the way, Tucker Carlson just happens to live there, and by them saying that he lives there is a de facto dox.
Okay, so hang on,
go ahead.
hang on, Rodney. The article is not just about the town. The article is about this tiny town that hosts the most popular show in cable news history. So,
I would beg to say that that's irrelevant. So it doesn't matter where he records. I mean, Joe Scarborough happens to record his and Mika's show down in Florida for tax reasons. They're tax dodging because they were recording and actually working in New York, and the taxes were so high that they actually talked MSNBC into building a studio down at Scarborough's house in Florida for tax purposes. I mean, I haven't seen the New York Times cover that. I just don't buy it. I don't buy it.
Okay, so you've got the biggest cable news show in history. Okay, so this is a very significant show, and you've got Tucker Carlson doing this show out of a town of about 1,200 people in Maine. So I understand why they would see that as a story. Tucker Carlson's show is much bigger than Morning Joe, but if they wanted to do a story on Morning Joe and why they chose to relocate to Florida as well, you can't become a public personality. You can't decide to build this enormous cable news show and then say, oh, I don't want any scrutiny about where I do the show from. I mean, if you want privacy, then don't host a cable news show.
Okay, so then I guess it's okay for Fox News to do exactly what Tucker Carlson said and start doing news shows on the towns, quotation mark, wherever where some of these left-wing journalists live. I think they would cry foul. I think they would say that their piece on Tucker Carlson is journalism, and the rejoinder from Carlson doing an expose on their nice little town that they live in a gated community, all white, no minorities that they champion. I think they would probably cry foul and say that was some sort of vile intent to try to stir up the violent right wingers to come and attack them. I'm just not buying this. Since when is the cable news shows the story? I know that's become, recently we've seen a lot of that where these talking heads interview themselves and make themselves a story instead of something that's actually real. Are you telling me that the New York Times, with everything that is going on in the world, that they can't find something more important than a little town in Maine? I would submit that where a show is broadcast from is irrelevant.
Okay, so I understand. I guess I have more sympathy with the New York Times. To me, that's a story. But I guess news judgment is an incredible. There's a huge amount of subjectivity when it comes to news judgment. So I don't have any big complaint with what you say.
I agree with you, Luke. I also agree that when you become a public personality, that term is can be loosely defined, you run that risk. But it used to be, Luke, our society had more, shall I say, rules of engagement, like in the military. You're not supposed to go and wipe out women and children and engage in unnecessary collateral damage. The same should go with politics. Now, Luke, we live in a time where anything goes. It is just absolute Mad Max type. There's no more rules of engagement. So I do understand where you're coming from there, and where I would go with this is, if they run the story, then that opens the floodgates. And my understanding is the story hasn't run yet, correct?
Correct.
And they're probably thinking about, do they really want to, open this tit for tat up? Because that's what would happen. I mean, I go back to rules of engagement. 10 years ago, Luke, this wouldn't have been on the radar. Now it is, because we've abandoned the political dynamic of the country have become so volatile, so vicious, so personal, and everything's on the edge, that this is what we've come down to.
So you're bringing up a related thought that I have. So I've been interviewed by TV crews probably at least 40 times. So at least 40 times they've come to wherever I'm living or wherever I'm staying or wherever I'm choosing to do the interview. And never once in those 40 occasions have they cared about how much dirt they track into the living room or the apartment or wherever I'm staying. They just they don't care about the damage, the dirt that they leave behind. And to me, this is both literal, because it's annoying having a crew, track dirt into your home or into, say, a friend's apartment that you're using for the occasion. It just shows their carelessness. When you see video of packs of news reporters or photographers staking someone out, they don't care how much damage they leave behind, say, to a garden or to landscaping. And it's not just this little thing about the garden or the landscaping. To me, it's metaphorical of a lack of concern that journalists have in general for the consequences of what they have to say. So every time I deal with a TV crew, up front, I say, take your shoes off when you're entering this house or this guest house where we're going to do the interview. I reiterate, I get on them, because I know they don't give a damn. They don't care how much schmutz, how much filth, how much dirt they track into either where I'm staying or where I'm borrowing a place to set up for the interview. And so there is a widespread carelessness among journalists and photographers about the consequences of what they do. Rodney.
Well, I have never. Now you've been on, as I recall, you've been on 2020 and some of the major shows, Luke.
Yeah.
I've not risen to that level. I've been in state media and stuff like that, but I have never allowed an interview to be conducted at my home, where my family would be, incidentally photographed or anything of that nature. I just have never done it. Whenever there's been a request for an interview or I've done one, they've always been at a public place or at a friend's office that was willing to do it. I just will not allow that, to enter, my private space, my home.
Yeah. And I'm just using it as an example of, they don't generally care about the consequences, but it's not just journalists, that's people in general. When you're interacting with strangers and they have a narrow agenda, generally speaking, we can't expect strangers to care about the consequences to us. And so, there's a huge amount of subjectivity in deciding what is newsworthy and what is not. And when you put yourself in the public eye, then journalistic scrutiny is one of the things that comes with it. And I remember when I wrote about the porn industry, all the porn stars, the reason they got into the industry was for the fame and the adulation, but they all wanted to maintain their fake names. And I thought that I should refer to their real names, not just their stage names. Then they would complain, well, that will now enable people to find us. And my position was, you've chosen to be a public figure. You can't get any more public than choosing to perform sex on camera. I don't have an obligation to protect people from knowing your real name. Your real name should go along with the very public things that you were choosing to do for a living. Now, they were so adamantly opposed that I often did not use their real names. But to me, if you're going to do something publicly for a living, such as performing in pornography, you should expect to have your real name revealed. Now, there's an interesting accompanying case of Scott Alexander. Scott Alexander apparently is his real first name, his real second name. He's also very public about being a psychiatrist based in Berkeley, California. And the New York Times is writing an article about him. And he was so freaked out that the New York Times would include his real last name that he took down his entire blog and made some major protest about it. So to me, if the New York Times does publish that article and does include his real last name, it's not so much that the New York Times has doxed him. He doxed himself by going public with his real first name, his real second name, and all sorts of identifying details. Any thoughts, Rodney?
Well, that was, remember, I think the last time I was on your show, someone asked about Tan Stoffel, and that was one of my major criticisms with him, was he was so paranoid. Would freak out if anybody even came close to knowing who he is, but yet he wanted to, it's almost like the old saying, Luke, have your cake and eat it too. You want to be a big personality, a quasi leader, and I say quasi meaning guide the ideology, whatever that is. But you want to do it from the safety of the Wizard of Oz's curtain. And you know what? That's not cool as far as I'm concerned, because you got to know who's behind the curtain. You got to know if they're credible. You got to know if they're the FBI or not. And so that I agree with you 100%. And especially there was a case, Luke, last year, believe it or not, where some guy, I think he was like 25, and he and his buddies rented some porn. And one of the guys recognized the girl in the video. He went to high school with her or whatever. And so he just, he might have been intoxicated or whatever, but he posts on his Facebook, wow, I just saw so-and-so in a porn video. Can't believe it. She's going by the name, whatever, Radiance or whatever they use. You're more familiar than I am. Mm-hmm. She brought charges and sued him under that particular state's revenge porn statute and lost. The judge threw it out and ruled exactly almost verbatim your position, saying that she was a basically an actor or an actress like Angelina Jolie or Brad Pitt, and is subject to scrutiny, and she lost the case.
Yeah, that's a good story, and I think this touches on a wider philosophical issue that people are under the misapprehension that their reputations belong to them. But, for example, Rodney, your reputation, your good name does not belong to you because your reputation resides in my mind and in the minds of everyone who knows you or knows of you. So you don't get to control your reputation. And so most people are under the misapprehension that they should have the right to control their reputation, but their reputation doesn't belong to them. It tends to reside in the minds of other people.
Yeah, Luke, just because you and I are legends in our own minds, doesn't mean the wider population embraces that same position, and people have a hard time with that very situation. By the way, that porn star case, her damages were that her father found out, her parents, mainly her father, who were quite wealthy, and disinherited her, and thus she suffered financially as a result of his posting that information.
Yeah. And I so love this topic because it touches on an even bigger topic, and that is almost everything bad that people do to us, we've usually played some role. We've either instigated it, provoked it, or placed ourselves in a position to be hurt by it, or are insufficiently robust to deal with it. So most people prefer to think of the origin of their problems as being entirely outside of them, when in reality, for most people, most of their problems have a great deal to do with themselves.
We all own a portion of a situation. A few times where my kids have come to me with grievances and wanted me to intervene. And I always ask them, how much of this do you own? How much of this is yours before I go and shoot my mouth off and make a proverbial ass out of myself. You need to step back and engage. And I believe in self-reflection, Luke. I do. And you have to also put yourself into the party's shoes. If you're, I'll just use an example, filleting around and using a bunch of irresponsible, say, racial epithets or something, and somebody, gets, has a negative reaction to it, you own part of that situation. I am still, like I said, that the people that had the firearms in Missouri, while I'm sympathetic to them, I do acknowledge they own part of that. Now, I think they don't own near as much of it as the mob, and we've disagreed on that, but I do agree with you that everybody owns a certain percentage of a situation.
Yeah, and people just see what they want. For example, I live in Orthodox Judaism. It's a small insular community, and like all small insular communities, there are a lot of public pressures to not say or do anything that could reflect ill on the group or that could damage anyone in the group. So I've done stories reporting about rabbis' bad behavior, whether it's their bad behavior with regard to money, their bad behavior with regard to sex, or other forms of bad behavior. And when you do this, you're rocking the boat, particularly if it's fairly close to you. And so there's often been very, strong opposition to what I'm doing. And so the framework that I always try to use is it in the public interest? So am I just reporting a titillating story, or do people have good reason to know if their rabbi is a convicted felon, if their rabbi is a fraud, if their rabbi has, played around with women that he was counseling? And so I think that's a good benchmark for journalists who are not held, generally speaking, in high esteem. You need to ask, when you do a story that could be incredibly damaging, you need to make sure, you need to aim at least for, most people are going to perceive this, who pay attention to the story, they're going to perceive it in the public interest. Because we all we all depend upon the tolerance of those around us, right? Whatever our politics and whatever our religious and cultural positions and whatever our hobbies and whatever we say on YouTube, if we become sufficiently obnoxious to people around us, they will drive us out. Like, if people around you get together and determined to drive you out, they can make your life an absolute misery. So that's why I think it's so important when, if I'm just talking on YouTube or writing on a blog, is I try to always frame things in a way that most people will see as being in the public interest. Any thoughts?
Well, a couple of things come to mind, Luke, where you talked about the Orthodox Jews being concerned about their overall their overall reflection. That's the difference, I think, between having a solid community with social cohesion versus my main criticism of Americanism, which is just individuality, do whatever you want, because people naturally see that as a reflection of your tribe, whether you're the Jewish tribe, whether you're a German, or whatever. They see that as a reflection of the tribe. And you know who's using this, to great effectiveness right now is this extreme left and this BLM movement trying to tar and feather all whites as being a bunch of racists bent on ethnic cleansing of blacks, which is completely illogical. If they wanted to, if we were that way as a position of policy, public policy, then why are so many Africans from Kenya and other countries seeking to immigrate here? It just doesn't make any sense. But that is the, that's part of just having a community that actually is conscious and has, social cohesion. Also, when you talk about people will drive you back, my brother was a prison guard for a number of years. And he used to say, it's not in our interest, meaning the guards, to have a guard being overly abusive, obnoxious, or anything like that, because the prison doesn't belong to the guards. It belongs to the prisoners. And if they really want, they outnumber them by a tune of about 20-1 at any given time. So if the prisoners really wanted to take the prison, they can. And so they used to say that nobody hated, an, pardon my language, asshole guard more than their fellow guards, because it put all the rest of them at risk.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of this show on Netflix, Narcos Mexico, tells the true story of a DEA agent, Kiki Camarena. And when you watch the show, I don't know if every detail is historically accurate, but when you watch the show, this DEA agent was deliberately taunting the drug lords that he was investigating. And so he was doing everything he could to humiliate them. And then as a consequence of that, he got captured and tortured brutally, and it took him about 2 days to finally die. But I suspect if he hadn't gone out of his way to try to torture, to humiliate these very dangerous people, they would not have tortured him, and they probably would not have even killed him or kidnapped him. So everything we do results in reactions. And so if you go out of your way to humiliate people, to hurt people, they will respond, and they won't always respond in the ways that you consider appropriate. So when I was watching this Narcos, I couldn't believe it. Like, you don't taunt people who have guns. You don't humiliate people who are dangerous, because those people are very likely to react in ways you don't appreciate.
Well, that goes to, we talked about this before, be aware of your surroundings and your limitations. Some people are unable to understand that or properly estimate or gauge the people that they are laying siege to or attacking or mocking or whatever, especially when you talk about narcos in Mexico, where not only do they have guns, they have no scruples in terms of doing some of the most horrific things to people. Doing living autopsies on them, skinning them. I mean, there's some amazing stories out of Mexico that I know are absolutely facts from some border patrol that told me what they have found in the desert, as a result of rivalries among these people.
Yeah, and you don't notice, for example, the tabloids doing a lot of stories about Meryl Streep, because Meryl Streep behaves herself. So celebrities who behave themselves, they don't end up in the tabloids. If you don't like the tabloid photographers showing you around, if you don't like humiliating and embarrassing stories about you continually appearing in the tabloids, then behave in a respectable fashion. Then you will bore people and they won't do stories about you. So I can understand why stars find tabloid photographers and tabloid journalists intrusive, and often the tabloids do behave terribly. But the tabloids are also responding to incentives that the stars are frequently behaving in ways that would shock the average person and titillate the average person and provoke the average person to wanting to know more. For example, you can't be sexually promiscuous without hurting a lot of feelings and without engendering rage in some people. It's a very dangerous way of living life. So particularly in 2020, if you're going to go out there as a man and be sexually promiscuous, there's going to be blowback. Like, not every woman is going to be content to have a one-night stand with you or a short liaison with you and then just move on with their lives. So there are things that we do that provoke reactions that we don't like.
You know, it's my experience. This is just based on my own life, Luke. People, guys that I knew of, and women too, by the way, both men and women, that were extremely hyper promiscuous in high school and even in college. Now it's 25, 30 years later, they're single. They've been enabled to formulate a healthy, long-lasting relationship or marriage. And, you know, I get this because I run into an old friend every once in a while. What happened to so-and-so? And it's easy to pick them out. They're all still single at, age 50, 51, and 52. And some of them, actually, Luke, they've not even modified their behavior. They're still trying to live like they're 18 or 19. And the problem is their kidneys are screwed up.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true for me. I remember when I just had my first intimate girlfriend, the first woman that I had sex with. I was in a relationship with her, and I kind of couldn't picture being sexual with anybody else for the rest of my life. But once I slipped that leash and had my second woman, then I was just off to the races. I mean, then it was like, whoa, this is the greatest thing ever. And I just, for the next few years, I just slept with as many women as possible. Never was able to sustain. Yeah.
Baskin Robbins, huh, Luke?
Yeah. But like, once I tasted the variety, then the power of making good choices in that regard just seemed to desert me, just like some people can't control their appetite for different flavors of ice cream.
Well, we see that, we see that, like I told you on the other show, my grandfather told me that be careful who you marry. It's the most important decision. He also went on to say that, it would have lasting ramifications in your life. And I can assure you that is absolutely true. I mean, I've been blessed because I've had an outstanding wife, and she stands behind me no matter what. I mean, it's rather traditional. I know that the alt-right likes to use the word trad, but I've enjoyed that for 20, almost 30 years now. And it's been awesome. Sometimes I know that I have done things that she has probably not been too keen about, or it may have been embarrassed, but she stood right there and has stood by me, through thick and thin. And I know that's probably hard to come by now because it's a different era. I mean, I got married, early 90s.
Yep. Let me read a little bit more of this article to you and allow you to comment. So it's from the Washington Post. All right. So it was already previously published in numerous other outlets about Tucker Carlson's love for this particular Oxford County town. And the reportages also include the story of his purchase of a garage to house his Summertime Tucker Carlson Tonight studio. Neither the reporter or the photographer specialize in the sort of reporting that would endanger Tucker Carlson's family or anyone else's family. With 25 years in the business, Murray Carpenter in recent years has written about the evolution of the hard hat, feeding grounds for whales, a media bigwig in Maine, the movement of women into the lobster industry in Maine, and mice brains. Yet Carlson, one of those stunning fabrications of his, called Carpenter a political activist. As for the photographer, Spinsky sampled this bit from his personal website. Tristan earned his master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley, and much of his work examines the intersection between people and the landscape. Point being, Spinsky wouldn't engage in a doxing expedition even if that's what the Times had requested. I'm not a paparazzi. I do not treat people that way, says Spinsky, who had no intention of photographing Carlson's home. The only thing I've ever stalked was a bird in West Africa, and I didn't find it. And he's referring to a killer assignment in search of the gray-necked pika Thoughts for the Audubon magazine. 4. The preemptive strike against the New York Times came on the same day as a federal sexual harassment suit was filed against Fox News. In a statement, Tucker Carlson said, "Some of my children stay in the building, the studio building, the New York Times planned to photograph. The paper was aware of this because I told them. They didn't care. Their story, like the one you are writing now, has nothing to do with covering the news. It was an attempt to intimidate and incite violence against my family for political reasons. It's disgusting." The building to which Tucker refers here is presumably the garage that he bought to house his remote studio. When a Maine newspaper reported on the host's plans for the garage, he claims the story violated his privacy. And Steve Collins, who covered the story for the Sun Journal, told Pointner that Tucker harbored suspicion about his motives. He repeatedly insisted he was sure I was out to get him, just another Democrat doing a hit piece, but he listened respectfully to my take on it. Moving the discussion to the building represents an evolution in Tucker Carlson's story, considering that on Monday he left his audience with the impression that the New York Times was after his residence. A Times spokesperson issued this statement about the studio building. The Times had been speaking with Fox News communication staff about the article for several days, had assured them we did not plan to photograph his residence or publish its address. It was only a few hours before the broadcast on Monday night that Carlson mentioned to us that some of his children sometimes stay in the studio in town where he broadcasts his show. At that point, we had not photographed anything and were still engaged in discussions internally and with Fox News communication staff about the potential article. Whatever the state of discussions, photos of the garage building and studio have already appeared in the media. Dean Baquet, executive editor of the New York Times, has spent a chunk of this week managing the dislocation caused by Tucker Carlson's misleading segment. He told us, Tucker misled his viewers into believing we would publish his address when he was aware that we had no intention of doing so. When the Fox network was specifically told we would not reveal his home. Many wrongly think that we did publish his address and even a picture of his house. It inspired the exact same kind of personal harassment against others, which he so indignantly and falsely claimed to be a victim of himself. Hours after the broadcast, someone attempted to break into the home of a photographer who doesn't even know where Tucker Carlson lives, and his followers have waged an attack on people who have nothing to do with the story. And if he has any honor, and if Fox has any honor, they will admit they were wrong. Okay, anything there that you'd like to comment on, Rodney?
Well, okay, let's just say for the sake of argument, this was legitimate. Okay, I wasn't aware that he actually was bought a garage or had a garage that he converted into a studio. So theoretically, Luke, he would had to have gone through the zoning and the permitting process. That becomes a public story because he's changing the use of a property. That does become legitimate news story, believe it or not. I know when I actually bought some land adjacent to my property and was going to use that and got the zoning changed. I mean, it was plastered all over the news, more so I think than probably when the Walmart was trying to come to the town. So I can see that angle. I take the position that it really is irrelevant where a show is broadcast from in terms of a national paper like the New York Times. Now, maybe this little community in Maine wanted to cover it, so be it. But the fact of the matter is, Luke, this day and age with the internet, public figures and even not public figures, if someone wants to find you, they're going to find you. And that's why I've always just been just absolutely refused to, alter my lifestyle or anything over politics. I certainly would never have moved if I was Tucker. I wouldn't. That to me, it didn't make sense. He said he liked the house, liked the neighbors and such. So, I certainly wouldn't have moved. But I can tell you what, where he lived, I think he lived in the suburbs in Maryland. Maine is far more. I would rather live in Maine than in the suburbs of Maryland at this point.
Yep. Okay. Are there any other stories, any other points you'd like to make?
No. I did want to comment. That's the reason why I came in was on the Tucker. Right. Was on the Tucker thing because I've been watching him. I do think that he is a target. He has the #1 news show, and he actually is probably the strongest voice for this what we would call nationalism and populism. Faction within the GOP that is doing battle with the old neocons that are trying to resurrect themselves.
Yep. Okay, good to talk to you, Rodney. We'll catch up another time.
Okay. Take care, Luke. Man. Thanks for the time.
Yep.
Bye.
Okay, I just want to continue on with a little bit more here from this Eric Wemple piece in the Washington Post. There's more than a legitimate story regarding Tucker and Maine. His second quarter ratings for 2020 stand as an industry record. To that massive cable audience, he began criticizing Maine Governor Janet Mills, a Democrat, in the spring over what he considered her overreaching response to the coronavirus. On one of his programs, Carlson invited a Maine restaurateur, a friend of his, to outline his plan to defy the shutdown. Not only did Tucker wish him good luck, the stickler for privacy stood by as the man recited the governor's cell phone number on air. Tucker has rocketed up the cable news ratings on the back of a populism that attacks the country's ruling class, which includes everyone associated with the New York Times. It was in that spirit that Tucker unleashed his Monday night slam job. Had the host confined his attack to the New York Times as an institution or even to its editor, Dean Baquet, then it would have been an unhinged, conspiratorial, but harmless rant. Yet Tucker Carlson bundled the whole thing with Spinsky and Carpenter, who don't run the Times or even a section of the Times. They're freelancers, and they live in Maine. He's pointing at the two weakest links in this power chain. It endangers the lives of journalists, and from my perspective, that seems to be the intention: to muffle and to intimidate, to provoke and to incite violence. The threats I'm getting are as vile and scary and intimidating and violent as you can imagine. And the Washington Post here has a video saying that Tucker Carlson has changed the shape of the GOP. Let's see what also is on Fox
shouldn't.
Right now.
At the very moment, prices are at their low. That's my fear. I'm not worried about the country. I'm not worried about the financial markets because in the long run, I know they'll be fine. I'm worried about you. I'm worried about how you will
Okay, that's an ad. And let's play this Washington Post article saying the future of the Republican Party looks like Tucker Carlson.
Trump has really transformed the Republican Party out of all recognition. I mean, I say this as somebody who was a lifelong Republican until the day after the last election.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
What do you have to lose? You're living in poverty, your schools are no good, you have no jobs.
His racism, his nativism, his conspiracy mongering, his vendetta against science, all these tendencies are now what defines the Republican Party in a way did not prior to Trump's election. One of the most disturbing things we've seen in the last few years is that even as Trump has alienated most Americans, even as he has governed atrociously, as he's presiding over a set of catastrophes we have not seen in perhaps a century, nevertheless, he still holds the support of roughly 85-90% of the Republican Party. And a lot of the base, they're not holding their nose. They love the guy. He is exactly what they've always wanted. But already you're starting to see the jockeying for the post-Trumpian future of the Republican Party. And I think you're going to see a lot of people who are basically made in Trump's image or have remade themselves in Trump's image, like Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley or Mike Pompeo. You're going to see some others who are somewhat more moderate, like Nikki Haley. But I think the greatest contrast is between really two of the extremes in the Republican Party. On the one hand, you have Larry Hogan, the moderate governor of Maryland, somebody who is pro-gun control, pro-choice on abortion, who took the coronavirus seriously, who's a real fiscal moderate, and just a very sane, sober, centrist kind of guy. And on the other side, you have Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is the #1 rated host on Fox News. He is watched by millions of people every single day.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson.
Why is Tucker so popular? Because he offers them more of what Trump does.
A moral obligation to admit the world's poor, they tell us, even if it makes our own country poorer and dirtier and more divided.
The speech says, look, our civilization is superior and we need to defend it. What's wrong with saying that?
Latin American countries are changing election outcomes here by forcing demographic change on this country. Their political success does not depend on good policies, but on demographic replacement, and they'll do anything to make sure it happens. This may be a lot of things, this moment we're living through, but it is definitely not about black lives. And remember that when they come for you, and at this rate, they will.
The reality is a substantial portion of the Republican base, they love that. They really go for that. That's what they wanted all along. They've never been happy with candidates like Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush, who seemed like, very tapioca kind of moderate, responsible Republicans. And certainly Larry Hogan is even more of the same. And, now if I had to bet my money, I would say that Tucker Carlson is a much more likely Republican nominee in 2024 than Larry Hogan. And I think that tells you a lot about the state of the party today.
Okay, I want to talk about the state of tabloid journalism. Is it really that bad? Is it just harmless? Is it just giving the people what they want? So I've got some thoughts here. Let's start off with the Columbia Journalism Review, July 1, 1993 issue. And I've had friends who've worked for the tabloids. At first pass, working for the National Enquirer, the Star, the Globe. I've also made money. I made money from giving a story to the National Enquirer about death threats that I was getting from a celebrity's manager. And I worked for the TV show Current Affairs on a freelance basis on several different stories, got paid for that. At first pass, working for the National Enquirer, the Star, the Globe, most of the other Tatler sheets is not so far a leap from the normal routines of straight journalism. Most of the reporters and editors come from careers in journalism. For the most part, their jobs require reporting, development of sources, and careful writing in the breathless, colloquial tone that the papers cultivate. Headlines like Space Alien Meets President Bush or Kitty Coughs Up Flaming Hairballs are generally left to the weekly world news, the most ludicrous of the papers published by the Enquirer. What distinguishes these tabloids is the hell-bent way they go after stories that involve the rich and famous. Stakeouts, undercover operations, payoffs, and outright bribes are standard tools in the tabloid reporter's kit. They also steal people's medical records. And if the story isn't there, they will inflate one, blowing a dispute over a restaurant menu into a failing marriage. It is in the Hollywood bureaus, close by the film and TV stars that are their standard fare, that the tabloids routinely go overboard. Reporters are expected each week to come up with startling news that will shock millions of readers already inured to the sensational. To ensure a steady flow of gossip, each of the tabloids has developed an extensive network of informants, publicists, waiters, valet parking attendants, and hospital clerks who can expect $100 or more for the price of a phone call. When that isn't enough, reporters are expected to fabricate stories, make up stories. They lay the groundwork for libel defense by paying off tipsters, even though no relevant information was provided after the stories are published. When attorneys for the defamed start calling, the tabloid lawyers can point to the check stubs and show that the reports were based on sources. Tabloid executives have emphatically denied that the practice of false sourcing exists, but Los Angeles writer Rod Lurie, who's now a movie director, proved the existence of the practice with the aid of internal ledgers slipped to him by National Enquirer employees. So Rod Lurie exposed the National Enquirer in Los Angeles Magazine in 1990 and 1992. In 1989, he got a hold of a list of the National Enquirer's paid tipsters. Soon after, Anthony Pellicano called Lurie. He very threatening, told me in no uncertain terms that he was working for the Enquirer and he was being paid a lot of money to get this file of tipsters back. Anthony Pellicano then called Rod Lurie's editor, Los Angeles Magazine, Nancy Griffin, and warned bad things can happen to nice lady editors. In March 1990, Rod Lurie was knocked from his bike by a hit-and-run driver, breaking some bones. He doesn't claim that Anthony Pellicano was somehow involved in the accident, but Lurie says Pellicano may have wanted him to think so when Pellicano called him shortly afterward. Pellicano knew about it awfully fast. So this is from the February 1992 issue of Los Angeles Magazine. Hey, if you thought the National Enquirer was sleazy before, look what it's up to now, using everything from mail theft, false police reports, and even blackmail to set up the town's biggest superstars. My wife's private line rang. A minute later, she returned slightly ashen and said an old friend was calling. When I took the phone, he didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. I recognized his voice immediately. Thought I'd never have to call you again, Anthony Pellicano said. Last time I heard from Pellicano was a year and a half ago while I was working on a story for this magazine called I Was on the Enquirer's Hit List. Anthony Pellicano, a notorious private detective who spent most of the last 12 years in prison, had been hired by the National Enquirer to discourage my story. He was the man who Assistant U.S. Attorney James Walsh claimed had intimidated government witnesses in the John DeLorean case and who, in a recent issue of GQ, bragged he'd beaten somebody with a baseball bat on behalf of a client. Pellicano said he'd killed hundreds of stories He strongly suggested that I drop mine. So this is Dr. Doovid Zakheim. He has a PhD in economics from Oxford University, at a very high position at the Pentagon, and he's also a rabbi and an Orthodox Jew.
In the Jewish war, that during the war against the Romans, if they could, the Jews would stop fighting on Saturday. Other than that, I wasn't aware of it. So the question was, what would I do? And the answer was, I gave them, in those days, we only had telephones, there was a signal. And if the phone rang a certain way, then I would pick it up. If it didn't ring a certain way, I didn't pick it up. And I was able to avoid going in Shabbos the entire time, even though, and Weinberger, Mrs. Thatcher, a number of people thanked me for it, even though I was in charge of supplying the Brits. Somehow I managed to avoid it, which is lesson number one. 99 times out of 100, I'll get to the 100th case, but 99 times out of 100, you really don't have to work on Shabbos. You can find a way. You can have a deputy. You can have signals in telephone calls or voicemails nowadays. You can, if you're going somewhere, I've read of, people call themselves Orthodox, flying on Shabbos, and they say, I have to. No, you don't have to. When I was undersecretary, if I needed to get somewhere, I flew Thursday night. I spent the extra day. If I had to pay for it myself.
So apparently in the new Netflix documentary on Brian De Palma, he says that he wanted to make the movie closer to the book, presumably, but if he'd made the movie based on the Tom Wolfe novel Bonfire of the Vanities, if he'd made the movie the way he'd wanted, it would have ended his career because it was so politically incorrect.
If I paid for it myself, you don't have to do that. And I didn't do that during the Falklands. I got away with it. One other story during my days as in the Congressional Budget Office, I befriended someone who is now one of the leading journalists in France, leading analysts. His name is Michel Gorfinkel. He's a frum Jew. His wife covers her hair. And we were talking, and this is, again, going back many, many years, 40 years. She told me that she had grown up non-religious at all, to the point where they were so assimilated, her sister was baptized. And the only reason she wasn't baptized was because she was constantly having colds. So whenever the priest showed up, she had a cold. He couldn't put her in the font. Anyway, she says to me, I became frum because of the Minister of Interior of France. I just looked at her. Turned out, in 1975, there was an explosion in front of the Reform Shul on the Rue Copernic in Paris. And the Minister of the Interior said, and now I'm translating for those of you who don't speak French, not only were Jews killed, but innocent people as well. And that caused mais les innocents aussi. And that caused an uproar, and actually an international uproar. I remember reading about it in the States. And she, who had this vague notion that there was something Jewish about her, started looking into it. And to make a long story short, she told me, here I am where I am. So you never know. It might even be a minister who can make you frum. While I was in the Pentagon, and it was interesting too, my boss, who was Jewish, used to tell me he would give me a dispensation so I didn't have to leave early on Friday. I never had problems with the non-Jewish people. I had meetings. One time I had a meeting with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. In those days, I was exceedingly junior. He moved the meeting because of Shabbos. I don't know if this is other people's experience, but over time, I've always found that the biggest, there's a pasuk, that, essentially the troublemakers are Jews. And very often that becomes a problem, particularly if you're junior and what are you going to say? And it makes you feel terribly awkward. I had another issue while I was in the Pentagon in those days. And this shows you how frustrating things can be. And again, where a Jew comes in. Rudolf Hess, the Nazi who had parachuted into England, was a prisoner in Spandau. And for years, he was in isolation. That was part of his life sentence, not to be able to talk to anybody. So in those days, I guess we still have them, but it's different now. In those days, a cable comes in from Embassy Bonn, because we weren't in Berlin in those days, that a soldier was fraternizing with Hess. So I went to my boss's boss at the time, and he wasn't Jewish, and he kind of poo-pooed it, but he said, look, go to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe, who was Jewish. And he said, what's the big deal? Once that happened, what could I say? So again, sometimes the problems emerge from within ourselves. Another time, I was at a meeting in Worcester in England, and I'm walking around the cathedral with this German named Karl Schnell. Now, I was in my 30s. Schnell was a good 15 years older than me, which meant he had been a late teenager during the Nazi years. Again, he knew I was Jewish, and he says to me, I stood up to the Nazis. I said, what did you do? He says, well, I was in the Hitler Air Corps, and my friends and I came to a meal without uniform. So my first reaction was, big deal. And then I thought to myself, you know what? Showing up in the academy without a uniform under the Nazis, that was pretty heroic. I've always had the attitude that they're innocent until proven guilty. You just don't know. There were some of them. There were Jews who survived in Berlin throughout the war.
Okay, we got Doovid back on the show. We're going to talk about this week's Torah portion. It's the Torah portion of Devarim. It's the first 3 chapters from the book of Deuteronomy. And Doovid, opening topic for discussion is that I notice among traditional Jews and also traditional Christians, there's a much greater ease with vengeance, or certainly with Jews, that the idea of vengeance, some Orthodox Jews take exception that it's always wrong, but generally speaking, among Orthodox Jews, as long as the vengeance is meted out justly, appropriately, to a correct degree, that vengeance isn't necessarily a dirty word from an Orthodox Jewish perspective. Any thoughts, Doovid?
Yeah, I did a lot of research. The elder church fathers like Marcion, actually like some Hindus or Indian Christians or sometimes alt-writers will be familiar, so much so that they interpreted the God of the Hebrew prophets was a different God than the God of Jesus Christ, and that was a heresy. I think at the Council of Nicaea, that Marcion heresy, that the God of the Hebrew prophets is the same God of Jesus Christ. But yeah, in the literature you could see that vengeance is a quality of the God of the Bible. Shem is even called the vengeful God, and it's not necessarily meant in a bad way. It's just a fact of reality. And presumably in the ancient world where suffering was much higher, however you look at it, from the stories internally within the Bible, or like a Steven Pinker type view, historical view, that the world is a much safer place. Suffering has been decreased, lifetime expectancy has increased, and all these various things that certainly in the Bible, no one is surprised that God is a vengeful God. Abraham argues a little bit with God, and maybe it takes to question the state of modern society, where people are like, God can't be vengeful. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and to me, it's a part of Judaism and Jews' overall much more relaxed attitude towards the natural passions, whether it's natural passions for sex, for fame, for money, for wealth, for honor. What these natural passions, Judaism simply wants to channel them. It does not say that you need to squelch them.
Yeah, and maybe eventually we'll get Luke into learning some Chabad Hasidus, and you look at the Chachma Bina Das, the Kabbalistic, the intellectual realms. Suppose in the head, the Chachma Bina Das, but the acronym the Chabad stands for, 3 words, roughly translated as wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and then the 3 lower emotive attributes: Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes, which kindness, strength, and beauty. And according to the Chabad model, the intellect should control the emotions, and other Hasidic models say the opposite. Actually, the heart controls the head. That's why Chabad is usually the most intellectual of the movements, believing that it's possible for the head to control the heart. But there's many movements within Judaism that look at it, like I was saying the other day about being high IQ as an Orthodox Jew, and a lot of modern Orthodoxy is made up of the members of Orthodox that either have a high enough IQ that they seek outside in secular education and on to understand at a deeper level than they would be allowed in the Orthodoxy.
So the thought of an angry God disturbs Christians much more than it does Jews. I think Jews are at peace with an angry God because Jews as a people tend to be much more emotional and emotionally expressive than, say, people from Northern Europe. So in the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, you hear about God's anger 26 times. So this doesn't bother me, doesn't bother most Jews that I know. We're not afraid or concerned or want to whitewash an angry God. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you have to really, I guess, look into the heretical scholars to get the best view on this. And I have, quite a few books on, the history of heaven, the history of these ideas. but presumably in the ancient world, none of the gods were really benevolent, and it was like, of course, like Luke was saying, that Freud's where the Bible said God made man in His image, Freud says no, man made God in His image. So under that kind of Freudian analysis, you say that, well, of course the Jews are going to believe in a God that has attributes similar to the Jewish people, in the same way that the Greeks believed in their pantheon of gods that mirror their attributes, or Hinduism, or any of these other things. Versus Christianity might be unique in the development of religions with a new ideal of suffering and looking after the poor, or various things. But I think even today, most people are pretty comfortable with this harsh understanding of reality. And certainly in the ancient world, pre-Christianity, I don't think anyone would have even considered anything other than like a god that so to say was vengeful and in line with the harsh material reality we all face.
Yeah. All right. So read a little bit more here from my notes on this week's Torah portion. So John Updike, the non-Jewish novelist, he wrote in his novel Seek My Face about a character, or perhaps if she is Jewish, she is unable to put the question of God quite the way a Christian would put it, in urgent terms of either or. For the chosen people, the relation has evolved beyond the possibility of dropped acquaintance into that of a familiarity that breeds contempt. I think this is just a brilliant summary of the different ways that Jews and Christians relate to the God question. Let me just reread it here by John Updike. Or perhaps if she is Jewish, she's unable to put the question of God quite the way a Christian would put it, in urgent terms of either you believe or you don't believe. For the chosen people, the relation has evolved beyond the possibility of dropped acquaintance into that of a familiarity that breeds contempt. Have you noticed any differences, Doovid, between the ways that Jews and, say, Christians relate to God?
Definitely. I mean, like 10 years ago, I started listening to the great teaching company lectures on like Christian theology in the history of Christianity. Till then, maybe even like 12, 15 years ago, that I started listening to the teaching company. Till then, I had never really put too much thought into it. Even if I'd done interfaiths or whatever, it was kind of more, just formalisms than in actual study. But since then, I've read quite a few books on Christianity. I've taken maybe 20, 30 courses on the, listened to the lectures on CD, and obviously there's countless difference between how Christians and Jews see the world. There's countless overlaps, but the nature of say God is love in the New Testament, to say, okay, there's a thing to love God, but God is love is and I used to say to my Hindu friends, because it comes up more often, is saying, no, I mean, Judaism, you say a person is God-fearing, and loving God is not enough, because if you love God without fearing God, a person won't be scared to sin. And from a Judeo perspective, loving God is very important, but because fear of God leads a person to not sin, and love of God does not necessarily stop a person from sinning, the fear of God is almost emphasized over the love of God, possibly in Islam also.
Yeah, and from a Jewish perspective, the Christian insistence on whether someone believes or does not believe, it seems bizarre, because from a Jewish perspective, it's not nearly as urgent. Our primary question is, how does someone behave, not how does someone believe. Have you been struck by the urgency of Christian attitudes? Does this person believe or not believe in God?
Well, yeah, and I guess the answer is obvious, because a Jew is not only a religion, but it's a racial, tribal identity. And so even if a Jew goes through periods or even long periods of disbelief, they could still stay within the fold or do the rituals, saying, well, even if it's dumb, it's my rituals, it's my ancestry. As opposed to Christianity, there might be some element of that, but it's less so. The hold upon a person once they stop believing in Christianity is going to be much less, because it doesn't have that same racial component as the whole of Judaism. And also, I think you have more to lose giving up Judaism, because, like, okay, the Jews, we might anti-Semitism and expulsions and yada yada yada, but like everyone knows, like relatively the Jews fare pretty good, relative to other people in terms of like social economical status, and so a Jew who doesn't believe in the religion might have more to give up than a Christian who doesn't believe in their religion.
Right. So what do you notice about the way that Jews talk about God, from secular Jews to Orthodox Jews? It just doesn't have the same urgency. It's also not really something Jews talk about a whole lot, whether or not they believe in God. It's generally kind of peripheral. What have you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, besides the Jews who talk about God, and there's always a few of them, every major synagogue, probably every minor synagogue's got a few God-type people, take prayer service seriously, and, always thinking about these issues. But no, I mean, generally, Jews, including rabbis, don't talk much about God. Even your sermon synagogue rabbis don't even talk about God that much. But within a formal study place like a yeshiva, there's going to be a segment of people who do take this very seriously, hence like the literature. So you're looking at Maimonides or all this Jewish literature on philosophy and these things, and you say, well, actually that's put out by a very small percentage of the Jewish scholars, and among Jewish scholars who study Jewish scholarship, that's one of the more likely things to be ignored, like Jacob Neusner, who they said largely just ignored Jewish philosophy. And so your average person, that's why Chabad was maybe able to make a niche in the market and grow as one of the most powerful groups, is just like take that niche of talking about God, Jewish philosophy, and theology, when no other competitive Jewish group is doing that.
So I grew up the son of a preacher man, as a Seventh-day Adventist. That's a form of Protestantism. And for my father, his first question about anyone was whether or not he's a believer. And so I think that's true of serious Christians, that they mostly want to know is like, where is this guy with Jesus? Is this guy on a close walk with Jesus, or is he distant from Jesus? Is this guy saved or not saved? But when Jews talk about non-Jews, the question of whether or not the non-Jew believes in God is not of particular importance. Or if Orthodox Jews are, say, talking about secular Jews, whether or not the secular Jew in the conversation believes in God, it's not a matter of great importance. Jews are primarily concerned with people's behavior. Christians seem to be primarily concerned with what people believe about God.
Yeah, we're expected to struggle with our faith. And, like the famous books, the Salvaitic, the Lonely Man of Faith, the Rebbe Botaic, the Fed Up Man of Faith, and possibly in Christianity, the person starts to loosen their belief, and all of a sudden it's like, why am I Christian? Judaism has a mechanism to question your faith, and a person's not necessarily expected. Like if you speak to your rabbi, your fellow Jews, and tell them you're struggling with your faith, it's not a big deal. Like if you say you're God forbid, like I started not keeping kosher anymore, or like I stopped keeping Sabbath, that would be probably a bigger deal than struggling with the faith. And maybe from the perspective of why is the person not keeping Sabbath, to how do you get them to keep Sabbath anymore, and is it a faith issue? But even from that perspective, the key thing would be get them keeping Sabbath again, regardless of whether you could answer their questions and get them to stop struggling with their faith, and convince them that Judaism is worth doing, even if the person does struggle with their faith.
Yeah, and so Jen is saying, Church of Entropy, saying in the chat that you guys did a great show recently. Do you remember any highlights from your show with Jen? I think you did one yesterday.
Yeah, we talked to this guy, Supra Libra. I mean, we're kind of looking at these quasi mathematical, scientific models of spiritualism. We're not, I present some models that are Kabbalah type, but most of the people are more Hindu or New Age leaning. So we had a guy who had some sort of model with graphs and colors and voting to. It was a little unclear. So like teaching people how to stream or be concise in their ideas could be very difficult in trying. But we have a few people with some ideas, and so it's moved more in the direction of spiritual science talk.
So this week's Pasha reminds me a little bit about my own blog and my own vlog, my own videos. It's like an endless recapitulation of Israel's sins. So when you go to Israel's Bible and you go to the Jewish Bible and you start reading it, like the Jews look really, really bad a lot of the time. They seem bitter, they seem ungrateful, they seem cruel. It's not a very pretty picture that the Torah and the Bible gives of the Jewish people, Doovid.
Yeah, I was thinking. Well, no, I mean because that's your, don't go with the signs of the times. If you're judging something by a temporal modern standard versus an internal standard, and say, oh, what they're saying in university on the news. Like it does, it's very hard to understand these texts or even understand why we do this stuff. But from the Jewish perspective, he's saying that these temporal phases of society aren't going to conflict with any internal truths. And I was thinking the Jewish nature of like Hashem, from like that Freudian perspective, where the nature of God in the Bible kind of mirrors behavioral patterns of Jews. And I had one roommate specifically, but a handful of Jews that knew how to do this quite well. I've never really seen a non-Jew do it. My dad could do it somewhat, but basically every time that this guy really wanted something and didn't want to do it, he was somewhat generous. But if it came down, like, take the garbage out, and we were roommates, and like he wanted me to do it, he would immediately give a list of like every single thing he's done on my behalf for like 6 months. And he was like, that time I bought you lunch, that time I let you the time, and he's like, and you don't want to do this one thing for me? I mean, come on. And so this guy was a pretty secular Jew, and I'm not sure if you've had roommates or situations like that where these people would recount like all the favors that they've done for you in order to demonstrate that that you factually owe them this time and probably a lot more. But if you look in the nature of that's kind of the Mosaic narrative of how the Mosaic narrative is kind of working. Is like, and don't forget you messed up with this time, and this time, and this time. So that's I don't know if that you consider that a Jewish characteristic, the culture of critique.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure if it's Jewish, but it is very annoying. You're making me think about what are my favorite traits in people, and I think predictability is one of my favorite traits, and men tend to have this frequently more than women. But I really like people who are predictable, and I like, what else do I like in people? I like people who are ordered. Like I don't like chaos. I don't like unpredictability. I certainly don't like criminal behavior. I like people who have good orderly direction, who are predictable, who are reliable, who say what they do and do what they say. I'm thinking, and I like people who are good listeners. So I hate, I just won't spend time talking to people who don't listen. It's just not worth it. So I think those are my favorite traits in people. What are your favorite traits in people that you particularly get along well with?
Usually common interest. Like, I guess I'm pretty amenable to getting along with anybody. Although, like in my personal space, like certain people, I call the tendency to people to do stupid shit for no reason. Like I haven't said that in to when I was more in yeshiva and synagogues, I talked to like younger Jews. It's like, just don't do stupid stuff for no reason. And there's a big tendency to like, let's just see what happens if we do this, and it's like like, no, let's not. And especially as you become more materially successful, And the kind of people that just like touch things, that come into your house and they're gonna touch something and like break it or put it back somewhere, or people that beg. And so I have pet peeves, but usually I could deal with those people. I just don't like them in my house or my personal space, where I would be affected by their behavior patterns that avoid me. So I don't think, I would probably make it. I don't have, favorites or something besides for minor pet peeves. So it's more about common interest.
Yeah, that's good. So let me think about, say, my 5 closest friends, if I was to describe their characteristics. Yeah, we have common interests, meaning topics that I discuss on this show. So all of my closest friends, they read a lot of books and they're well informed. They're all good listeners, and they're all share a similar politics to me, kind of a dissident right politics. And they're all reliable, and they don't create drama. They don't have lives filled with drama, and they don't create drama for me. They're predictable, and they're all, they all have jobs. They all pay their bills. I think, all my closest friends own their own homes. Well, really, the bank owns their own homes, but they're paying off a mortgage. I think they're all earning 6 figures. So how would you describe the qualities of, say, your top 5 friends?
Well, I don't really, the word friends is difficult because I'll throw it around, and like friends I have a lot of association, friends that I might call regularly, or friends that I just call a person a friend that I meet, and even I might even call my enemy friends. So and then there's a factor of loyalty and people that have taken your side and been good to you. So depending on where you're at, especially when I was in Orthodox culture, you have a lot of friends across the board. You can't just have rich friends, and society's pyramidal, and you're not in a neighborhood place where people are siphoned off by social economic status. In any way you slice it, the majority of your friends are going to be poor, and so there's a different factor of loyalty. And I even said that to like Babs on the show, and I think Brundle, we talked about it, and Luke took my side. It's like, buy yourself a friend. And I was saying, like, I have certain friends that I have always paid for. They've never once paid like lunch or things, and they've been, can I get $5-10 for years, and like I don't think once ever they treated me. Although there were times when I was younger in New York that there was reverse relationship where a person treated me every single time. There was not once where I paid for them. And so it's important not to look at friends like a social status. And if you're out there in society, like the Hare Krishna temple, and I help manage the food service, and we give out food, and I'm just like, I need some people to help. There might be a congregation. This is Indian people. It's not even Jews. But there might be 100 people there, and it's just like, someone want to help with the food, and whoever steps up, you don't really know who's going to step up, but because that's what I'm doing the service of food distribution. I become friends with the people who step up to the plate. Or it could be something small where it's like someone you would never consider being friends with, but they did they did a favor for you. I think in Hebrew, the concept, and I'll even let Luke explain, is called a hakor tov, which means recognizing the good or repaying someone for good they've done to you. So sometimes it's hard to draw the line between friendship and a hakor tov. You say, oh, I have a hakor tov to that person. I might just say they're my friend. And so there's a different dynamic between like, no, I have a lot of friends that are losers. I have a lot of friends that make poor decisions, and I didn't drop them as my friends because they're losers who make poor decisions. In fact, like I bought that guy lunch, every few weeks or months for years now. Or I've been lending that guy money for a decade now, and unfortunately, I never expect to get it back. And maybe Luke would be that kind of guy also if he had better economic situation. I don't know, how do you navigate that? I mean, how could not the majority of your friends be poor?
I would not want dysfunctional friends. So someone who's poor year after year after year, they're dysfunctional. So someone who falls on tough times for a brief period, that's something else. Okay, I need to take a really brief break, so hang on, Doovid. I'll be right back with you. This is Rick Wilson talking with Stephen Colbert.
Let's talk about the Lincoln Project. It's burst onto the political scene with a series of viral anti-Trump videos that have even caught the president's attention. Trump tweeted this about you and your colleagues, quote, "I didn't use any of them because they don't know how to win, and their so-called Lincoln Project is a disgrace to Honest Abe." Wow, Trump is not usually so sensitive. How did you get under Trump's thick rhino-like skin?
It was amazing that this man of such sterling moral character and constitution was irritated by a few political consultants who made some viral videos about him. He's normally very, very much the robust, strapping man who stoically takes any adversity, or he's a whining bitch addicted to Twitter.
Yes, he is a bitch. That is the biggest insult, comparing someone to a woman. I hate us.
Now let's talk about who is involved with the Lincoln Project. At least 7 members of your leadership team are Bush-Cheney campaign alumni. And I gotta say, we really miss Bush. He always did what was right for the country, that country being Saudi Arabia.
George W. Bush had such skill. Unlike Trump, he knew how to keep human suffering a few more degrees of separation away from us.
Well, look, there's no president in the history of this country who's done more to abuse the office of the presidency, to treat Americans in ways that are racially and morally and economically divisive. And he is unquestionably the worst president in our history.
We agree with you, Rick. Trump's failures are much, much worse than George W. Bush's. I mean, Trump is responsible for bad deficit increases, bad corruption, bad racism, and bad countless deaths. But George W. Bush, on the other hand, is responsible for good deficit increases, good corruption, good racism, and good countless deaths.
You know, I miss the Republican Party before it embraced Trump, back when it only laid the groundwork for him.
Moving on, you've received glowing reviews from the MSNBC crowd. Let's take a look at this.
I'm a big admirer of these Trumpers, or the Bulwark people and the Lincoln Project people.
I don't give money to political organizations. I've given money to Lincoln Project because of ads like this.
The Lincoln Project is like watching a Jay-Z Nas rap battle. I mean, they don't let up on this president.
I want the Democrats to pay attention to the Lincoln Project. They're doing a superb job.
The Lincoln Project, those are good commercials.
Rick, how rewarding is it to win over the people you've demonized your entire career?
You know what? The person I'm interested in demonizing right now is Donald Trump, and the person the Lincoln Project is focused on is Donald Trump. And the fact is that Americans from all walks of life have recognized that we need all hands on deck in this fight to save this country. And you know what? Allies come from all different stripes and all different walks of life, and I'm happy to accept the support and encouragement from folks across the spectrum.
Now, you've written tweets disparaging Muslims and members of the LGBT community, but we have to take issue with your remarks on attendees of the liberal Netroots conference. You tweeted, "Dear Netroots lefties, you are Barack Obama's bitch. You are pathetic little whores satisfied with crumbs and head pats." Rick, when was the exact moment you realized those pathetic little whores could be tapped for money?
You know, the fact of the matter is, everyone on Twitter lives in a culture where there's a lot of fronting and a lot of shit talk. Okay, and not every quote that you have on Twitter from the past is something that you're going to live with forever. These things are these.
Okay, I'm back. So let's return to this week's Torah portion. So there is a commandment that you were touching on there, Doovid, that you should look at people with a good eye. So Judaism essentially enjoys a positive mental attitude, and gratitude is a key part of that. So one should develop a good eye, aka the ability to see the good in other people. So the rabbis of the Talmud taught us, even if there be a sharp knife held at your throat, do not despair completely. Not all successful people have a positive mental attitude in all areas of their life, but in those areas of their life where they are successful, they do have a positive mental attitude. So one thing I particularly love about Lubavitchers, the Chabad Hasidim, is that they tend to overwhelmingly be happy people. So do you have any thoughts on Judaism? And it's a commandment that people should be happy and have a positive attitude.
Yeah, man, Chabad says "Trach gut, sein gut," in Yiddish, think good and it'll be good, which is like the Norman Peale's power of positive thinking. People question sometimes whether mitzvah gedolah liros v'simcha is in Psalms, but people question whether happiness is actually a mitzvah, but the value that it improves to your life. And as me and Luke have been mentioning almost multiple times every stream, because it's a factor in Jewish law, where generally the only thing that pushes off Jewish law is health and a livelihood, and it's because v'chai b'hem, and we're supposed to live by the law. The Torah is here to have us live a successful life, and even the language of Moses, basically says that if you do this stuff, you're going to have material success. Things might not always go as planned, but part of the path is material wealth and a beautiful family and kids that keep the tradition, as opposed to other traditions that the path of righteousness may not include the promise of material abundance, kind of like Judaism does.
Yeah. So
go ahead. Although, just on the the poor, like the friendship in I mean, it's good to have associates who are well-to-do and maybe even say like hang out. And I was thinking the famous Rabbi Akiva, where I think Rufus, the evil Roman general, I forget exactly where in the Talmud, asks Rabbi Akiva, why did God create so many poor people? And Rabbi Akiva said, in order to save people like us from hell. And you look at it that way in the sense that, okay, maybe I made a lot of mistakes, and I really hurt a lot of people. God forbid, like maybe I was a really bad dude, and I hurt thousands and thousands of people. God forbid. And how could I make that up? But because God has created a world in which there's thousands and thousands of poor people, millions and millions of poor people, even if I had, God forbid, wronged millions and millions of people, because there's so many millions of people that are in a bad status, that you could conceivably help them out of it. That the perspective is that the poor people are there to provide salvation, and I think even Luke, in your neighborhood, that there's a certain compassion for the beggar. Most people in my area, Orthodox Jews, have hours, or if it's a modern Orthodox place, then they don't like the person going person to person to beg. The rabbi will still give them. It is very unlikely. The Jewish community almost never cuts someone off. They might cut a person off from giving him money, but in terms of medical aid and food or shelter, the person has to basically be criminally unsafe, that the Jewish community wouldn't outreach to help out with those basic necessities.
Right, but the world's very different than it was, say, at the time of the writing of the Torah, or even the writing of the Talmud, or even the ongoing rabbinic tradition. Since the Industrial Revolution, by and large, if you're going to be poor in an incredibly prosperous country like the United States, or even Western Europe or Australia, if you are poor today, if you are desperately poor today, and you're of at least average intelligence, then the odds approach 100% that you have some addiction operating in your life. And all the help that you're giving someone, you're simply helping an alcoholic, you're simply helping an addict, you're helping someone continue his dysfunctional way of living. Virtually all homeless people are mentally ill and addicts, so all the money you give them does no good. It may prevent them from hitting bottom. So no, I don't believe in enabling people's addictions. So if somebody's poor year in, year out, like you're talking about, how you're constantly buying them meals, lending them money, that person's a drug addict. That person's an alcoholic. That person is unable to function in society because he doesn't get along with other people. And so I'm not a big fan of subsidizing somebody's alcoholism or drug addiction. There's some damaging addiction that he's got going, and I don't think that it's meritorious to try to lengthen the time till this person hits absolute bottom and realizes that he needs to get help.
Yeah, well, obviously I disagree, and saying, I'm sure Luke, I talk about Shomer Shabbos quite often, where I worked as helped out Gabbai, and no, we never turned anybody away. We had free food there, and even historically, synagogues were places to sleep, and the poor people were expected to you leave the synagogue open so that poor people could sleep in them. Need be, going back 1,000 years, but that's fine. But a lot of Jews have a very soft heart for that, and at least food, and to say that we're not going to leave you starving, we're not going to let you die in the street. That's not going to help you. Maybe giving a person money, and Luke might have a point, and but I think most people in the Jewish attitude would disagree with that kind of capitalist economic extremism. Is no, you can't let people die even according to their own bad decisions. If a person is starving or needs shelter only due to their own bad decisions, it's still a mitzvah to help them.
Well, do you disagree with me that anyone who's hungry in the United States of America today is a drug addict or mentally ill or an alcoholic? Because there's absolutely no understandable reason why anyone would be hungry in the United States of America today, this incredibly prosperous land filled with opportunities. If you're hungry, you are deeply, deeply, deeply screwed up. and just giving you some food or giving you some money simply enables you to carry on with your addiction. Do you not agree
Well,
that these people are addicts?
I mean, one thing, you're going to have a certain segment of the population that really is below 70 IQ or whatever. It is going to need that kind of assistance their whole life. And even if what you say is true, and saying like, yes, that America, a lot of rabbis say, you got to be an idiot not to be able to get ahead in America. And even now, COVID-19 or whatever, like relatively a person could pull himself together, make some dollars, even to, get married, have a family, at whatever level they're at. But the person who's saying, I want to have impact in charity, generally, the most impact is starving. I mean, there's levels of charity at all levels, like Luke giving me a microphone, or that's charity. But no, I'm saying that if that could have given 20 homeless people a meal, or especially Jews, and then we were talking about Judaism, is said that you could have long periods of struggle with faith and still, really have no problems in the communal Judaism. In the same way, people could have bad years of their life. They could, be down and out for years. They could be down and out for a decade. And, reality, they could be down and out for the rest of their life. And generally, if you're within the Orthodox community, maybe not like as a convert or a born again Jew, but if you were born into it, usually the general economic principles that Luke is saying, there might be some people that would try to whip people into shape, but it's like, no, I mean, we're not going to let them fall behind, not having a place to eat or sleep or basic medical care unless they're criminally dangerous, even if it's because they're lazy and a drug addict and, no good Nick or whatever that, I mean, you don't see that. I mean, you're saying like philosophically, but I mean, are you saying that as an argument, or are you saying that that's what you see?
Yeah, I'm saying that anyone who's hungry in the United States of America today is mentally ill or a drug addict or alcoholic, and just giving them money does them no good. I'm sorry?
I mean, in your community, that you agree with me that the Jewish community will, at a certain level, like, I mean, some of the rabbi don't give that guy money, but there's almost no rabbi that's going to say let the guy starve, even if he's been coming for 10 years straight. God forbid. I've been, even here in Detroit with the food distribution, there are people who've been coming for as long as I've been doing it. And in Shomer Shabbos, when I was there were people who came there for the food, as long as I was there, over 5 years. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are still doing it. And the people who donate, they don't really mind, saying that's, you're saying they prefer to have more impact. And also the understanding that the person could have a bad turn of events, especially if you listen to like Hasidic stories, they're full of the expectation that you could have a good turn of events, that you become a millionaire, you could have some break and something could really turn your way. God forbid, some things could really go against a person, and a person could be a wealthy person reduced to poverty. So, I was in Shomer Shabbos, I said you could be a person whose name's on the wall, the people who are donating money, and God forbid, lose status and be a person coming in for charity. Or you could be a person just coming here purely out of needing something to eat, and one day your name's going to be on the wall because you're the one giving money. And that's generally how Judaism works. Even in your area of your wealthy, powerful synagogue, maybe a handful of those people came from wealthier families and are descending socially, but probably most of those people, arose from upper middle class, to that level, and a lot of them may be Holocaust survivors or something, and have that weak spot in their heart to say like, no, I'm not, like, you gotta, at least for a fellow Jew, like, I'm not going to let the guy starve, even if he's a worthless bum, no good Nick.
Right. Well, nobody's starving. I've never seen a starving person in the United States of America, and I'm not aware of anybody dying from starvation in the United States of America. That they may not like
within the Jewish community, we're not going to cast them off to the Goyim. So if you're talking about someone who grew up internally in one of like the LA Orthodox community, casting him off to the Goyim is like leaving him to die. And so it's like, no, like you can't cast him off to the goyim, like unless he's like criminally dangerous.
Well, I tell you what, the more shuls say give away food, the more homeless bums they have congregating at those shuls and setting up, cardboard tent cities beside those shuls. So the more that you give to the homeless, for example, the more insane, criminally inclined, dangerous people you attract to your synagogue. So,
yeah.
So why does the synagogue simply say collect food after a kiddush, uneaten food, and then they donate it to a homeless shelter? But if your synagogue allows people to line up for food vouchers or to line up to get fed, then those synagogues attract a whole lot of dangerous, criminally inclined, insane, addicted people.
Yeah, I would have to push back extremely strongly. I mean, maybe LA, you haven't seen this, but King Solomon, the glory of the king is in the masses. All of the major rabbis that I've seen, without exception, live geared towards lower middle class. Like you're a man of the people, and so it's Borough Park, Williamsburg, Moshe Feinstein, who lived in the apartment building his whole life, even Yeshiva University, the Rav Soloveitchik. None of these people lived extravagant, wealthy lifestyles, and they tiered towards the mass of the Jews and the mass of the Orthodox Jews, which are generally lower middle class. So you might have like Rabbi Shapiro, like a few wealthy Jews in the suburbs and a modern Orthodox community, but would be considered the Gedolim, the leaders of Israel. They always live in the heart of the masses and are essentially tiered towards the poor people. You can't lead the Judaism from a rich suburb. You can only lead Judaism from the heart of Brooklyn or the heart of Manhattan or something. You can't lead Judaism from Englewood. You could donate a lot of money. You could have a bunch of doctors and friends with big houses. But I would extremely push back in saying, Luke, you might have a bunch of great people out there in your area, but none of those people are considered like Paisiks or great Gedolim. And anyone that is probably living in the heart of the Orthodox area that's tiered towards lower middle class.
Okay, so one separate question, because we've been on this topic 24 times over the years, so we've each gotten to articulate our point of view, and there's certainly a great deal of support for your point of view within the Jewish tradition. So one other topic that I wanted to raise is what happens when someone comes to these texts who is not Jewish by genetics. So you have the Torah, you have this inspiring divine text, but it is mediated through a particular people with a particular genetic code and a particular historical experience, people whose family and friends are Jewish. But what happens when people who are not of the Jewish bloodline pick up this text? What happens then? Does the Torah get watered down? Does the Torah get distorted? Is the observance of the Torah pushed out of normality? Is it just messed up and distorted when people who don't have Jewish genetics start coming to these texts, either as converts or as simply non-Jews who are interested in learning more about Torah? What do you think?
I think when we discussed it very beginning, when we first started talking, say generally, from the Orthodox perspective of people who care about being meticulous in the law, teaching Torah to non-Jews is implying the oral tradition, not the written tradition. You're allowed to discuss the written tradition with non-Jews. It may not be recommended, and most people hold that that doesn't originally that just meant scripture, but now anything that's readily available to goyim that they could find on the internet or on their own, you could discuss with them. And these days that's basically everything, because you even a major rabbi, there's more stuff in the English language on the internet than even most major rabbis had read. And so the question maybe is the health and security of the Jewish people. So in the ancient times, let's say the tribal goyim didn't know that the Jews kept Sabbath, and so if the goyim figure out that the Jews keep Sabbath, it could make the community weak and susceptible to an attack. And like obviously everyone knows the Jews keep Sabbath now, but certain things within that, and then with the state of Israel, before the state of Israel, almost everybody had a pretty secretive view towards non-Jews in Torah. After the state of Israel, there's been, even like the Lubavitch Rebbe and the Hasidus, where that held you could preach somewhat to Goyim. It was still very restricted on what has happened. But after the state of Israel and the power of Israel and mass media and Jews kind of like stepping up and like, yeah, we're Jews, we're awesome, that it's kind of became a free-for-all where you might have in inner Orthodox circles like rabbis that don't even speak English that are worried, that, that don't even know that they have Wikipedia pages. Like I remember in Borough Park, you're looking up on Wikipedia and these rabbis like, what do you, like, who made this Wikipedia page? Like, we have to do something about it. So in the internal world of Orthodoxy, where people don't even speak English, their power to know what's going on in the external Jewish world is very limited. And it's meant to be that way in a language barrier.
Right. I don't think that any of the rabbis who partook in the creation of the Mishnah and the Talmud had any idea that one day non-Jews would be able to read what they were saying. This, I'm sure, would have been absolutely inconceivable to all the rabbis of the Talmud, that one day the Goyim would get to listen in essentially to their conversations. I don't think they ever thought that this might happen, Doovid.
Well, I mean, the opposite. I mean, they were scared that would happen. That's why it's encoded. I mean, that's why it's written with no punctuation and in a semi-codified way. And I mean, the Mishnah is more straightforward, but even the Mishnah is somewhat coded. But I mean, the Talmud is extremely coded, and the likelihood was because they were scared that the Goyim would get a hold of it, and even the writing of the laws in the first place, where the fear was that other people would get this secret wisdom, if not lower caste Jews, lower non-Kohanim, or the whatever Jews were in power that didn't want other Jews having access to this power, let alone non-Jews. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, you don't really think. I mean, obviously, the people who wrote the Talmud were extremely scared of other people getting a hold of it and made a substantial effort to make it unintelligible to anybody other than someone within the tradition.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. So
I mean, they might not have predicted Art Scroll one day.
Right. Yeah.
And then you think Art Scroll was officially given by Agudas Yisrael to President Clinton. I mean, and I guess going back, like Prince King Charles, or I forget the names, but King Henry or whatever had the first Bamberg Shas. One of the first Shasas ever printed went to the King of England. And so there could have been like an elite type thing where we always gave our books and talked about it with the elites, even going back to Roman times. And if we go more into this Jacob Neusner, this kind of concept that secular Reformed conservative Jews push, that nowadays people might put it in Noahidism, but they basically planned, or like a Masonic conspiracy. But they kind of held that Reformed Judaism could become the religion of American Goyim. And to some extent that's worked. I mean, however you look at the American Goy, the relation between Protestant evangelicals, or just the high rate of intermarriage, that there's tens of millions of American Goyim that may have partial Jewish blood, or at least have semi cousin or close family members that are intermarried with Jews, that it's created a completely different dynamic than historically, where basically everybody discusses Torah texts with a Goyim, and in all Jewish sects lobby politicians and power brokers and argue with them that our interpretation is the best interpretation of Judaism. There may not be parallel. Maybe in Spain there was such a during the Inquisition, but that would be out in the open, this kind of like secular Judaism, where President Obama and almost the majority of the elites in America are kind of just these like secular Jews, even though they're Goyim.
Right. Okay, I had another note here. So in Deuteronomy, so why would the rabbis be concerned about the non-Jews getting to overhear their conversations or to read, for example, the Talmud when it's all just so wholesome? Why would they care? Wouldn't they think that it would be good for the Jews?
Well, I mean, the fear was that the Goyim would have killed us. You know, if they that it was really a matter of life and death. That if the Goyim understood our practices and our way, kind of like the Israeli attitude, like, of course our neighbors are secretly trying to genocide us, and it's only because they can't figure out a way to do it that they haven't done it. But in a biblical sense, in the olden days, maybe that was actually the case, and so it wasn't necessarily the Jews were trying to create a code so we could control international banking. It was just that we thought if like our neighbors understood our way of life, they would probably kill us.
Okay, and I had a note here from Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 25. God says to Moshe, "This day I shall begin to place dread and fear of you on the peoples under the entire heaven. When they hear of your reputation, they will tremble and be anxious before you." So God is telling Moses that essentially all the people of the world are going to be afraid of the Jews. So if indeed surrounding peoples did hear of the Jews and became afraid of them, then it makes sense why they would not want to let Jews pass through their land. Right? So on the one hand, God's telling Moshe, all the surrounding nations, all the nations of the world are going to fear you, but if all these nations fear you, they're not going to treat you very well. So it seems kind of a strange gift to tell Moshe and the Jews that all the other nations are going to fear them. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to just mention, just because in the Parsha, and there's only like 2 or 3 mitzvahs in this Parsha, that I think in the first chapter is the mitzvah to establish leadership and judges and thousands, 110. And then it's also listed as a mitzvah directly to not fear repercussion when judging a wicked person, that if you're a judge and the person before you is wicked and guilty, that person's commanded by God to not have fear to judge the person guilty. If we skipped over that, it's probably important to mention that. And I apologize. What did you just ask again? Sorry, that slipped me.
Yeah, let me read it again. So in Deuteronomy chapter 2:25, God says to Moshe, "This day I shall begin to place dread and fear of you on the peoples under the entire heaven. When they hear of your reputation, they will tremble and be anxious before you." So essentially, God is telling Moshe and the Jews that all the other nations of the earth are going to fear them. So therefore, it makes sense that the other nations would not want the Jews coming through their land. They would not want Jews around them because they're going to be afraid of the Jews. So it seems kind of a strange prediction, a strange blessing to give the Jews and to transmit to Moshe that all the other nations of the world are going to fear you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my mind slipped. But yeah, I was saying generally from our text, the halakha, what it's written from the direct commentary, is that when Goyim see the scripture or tefillin or something, it's supposed to strike fear in them. So so that if a non-Jew picks up our Jewish text and starts reading the Bible, it's supposed to strike fear in them, just like when a non-Jew sees a Jew in tefillin, it's supposed to strike fear in them. In generally, from a positive perspective, the Jew or the Jewish text is supposed to strike an immediate fear in the non-Jew that there is a God and there is reward and punishment for the person's action. So there could be a tendency to be like, oh, there's a God and there's reward and punishment for action, but it's the Jews who are going to be, judged negatively because the Jews are, the negative influence on society. But from the Jewish perspective, we're saying like, nah, the Jews are going to stack up the best when it comes to judgment. So if a non-Jew is reminded about God and reward and punishment, so to say, they're going to fall in line. And you say, okay, does it work or not? Or I don't know if you agree, kind of from the narrative perspective of the Bible or the sages, that's that's what we're supposed to believe. As a Jew, we're supposed to believe that our God's going to protect us, and the non-Jew is going to look at our text or look into us, and he's like, oh crap, I better not mess with these people, or their God is going to destroy us.
Right, because God wants to be feared. It's a commandment to fear God. So I notice that I always treat people a little better if I have a little bit of fear of them. Certainly, employers or important clients or girlfriends. Like if I have no fear for of my girlfriend, then I'm going to release a lot more flatulence than if I have some fear that she might leave me. I'm going to treat her a lot better if I have some fear that she might leave me. And so is it not a mitzvah for Jews to have fear of God?
Yeah, I mean, generally we were talking about belief so much, but in Judeo literature, the general literature is about love and fear of God, and then the different takes of schools of what's more important, fear or love of God. And that's like a division line between the Hasidic movement and the Misnagid movement. The Hasidic movement focuses on love of God, and the Misnagid movement focuses on fear of God. But in most of the literature, like there's books about trusting God, and even Chovos Levovos, and one of I did one of the most famous book on philosophy. Still deals more with the subject of love and fear of God than belief in God. So from that Judeo perspective, it's probably like belief. Your average Orthodox Jew, like, do you love God? Do you fear God? They don't talk about it that much. There's elements, it's in the text. The rabbi might mention it every once in a while, but from our religion, fear and love of God, I think, is mentioned more than belief in God, and is more fundamental in our scheme of things. And as opposed to Christianity, where there's not really a concept of fear of God, just love of God. The Judaism is looking for that balance, where basically love and fear should be at an equal amount.
Okay, I'm going to move on for today. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, Shabbat Shalom, and you get the outdoor minyan. I'm going to be going in about an hour to pray. Tisha B'Av, I guess, is Wednesday, so I'm not sure if you're going to do a Tisha B'Av stream or more solemn mode. But have a great Shabbos, everybody, and thanks, Luke, for encouraging me to study and talk Torah.
Okay, good to see you, Doovid. Take care.
Things are a culture that runs both ways.
Now, Rick, the Lincoln Project has been wildly successful and is growing faster than ever. The Washington Post reports that, quote, advisors to the Lincoln Project, which they say has about 30 employees and raised $16.8 million this quarter, will soon expand to include ground operations. Now, given that half of you worked for Bush, for these new ground operations, how many people should we expect to die?
All I can say is we'll be greeted as liberators.
That worked last time, right?
Let's talk about how the Lincoln Project spends all those Maddow viewers' money. Here is how much 3 other top liberal super PACs spend on operating expenditures compared to total disbursements. In other words, the percentage spent on overhead costs, including salaries over their lifetime. Senate Majority PAC spends 16.8% on overhead. Unite the Country is 14.75%, and American Bridge 21st Century is 46.7%. What do you think the percentage is for the Lincoln Project?
Well, you're going to see our new report coming out in July, which represents our first the first major period in our campaign that wasn't involved in startup costs and acquisition costs and data costs. And you're going to see that we are putting about 85 cents of every dollar into voter contact.
85% with 15% going to overhead would be a lot better, because right now it's the opposite. 11% goes to independent expenditures and 89% goes to overhead.
89.3% on overhead sounds like a lot, but I can't get into the right headspace to make a 10-second ad without wolfing down endangered mollusks in a titanium catamaran with my Bush administration buddies.
Well, as I've said before, you're looking at the startup and acquisition costs from the first quarter. The second quarter is going to show that we have a massive amount of money escrowed in the bank for media and for voter contact this fall, and that our numbers are competitive with any other PAC, and in fact much better than most.
Sure no, so that's a lot of cash.
All right, well, given all this, we had our media arm, which is me and I'm expensive, make a new Lincoln Project ad. Take a look
President
at this.
Trump is the most incompetent, corrupt president in history, and we need to do everything we can to stop him after compensating our strategists complicit in the deaths of countless innocent lives and paying for overhead such as lodging at the W Hotel and the Standard, both of which have fantastic roof decks. Stop this corrupt grifter ruining America. Donate to these savvy grifters who ruined it before, and hope you don't look into them.
All right, Rick, we know you have to go hoover up some more Rube cash, so that's all the time we have. Thank you to our analysts and guest Rick Wilson of the Lincoln Project. Thanks a lot, Rick.
Okay, come on. That's pretty good stuff. Okay, it's now a lot easier, apparently, to fire people for saying racist or sexist things. The National Labor Relations Board has gotten woke, ruling by an all-male, all-Republican three-member panel.
So the NLRB just made a ruling against GM. A ruling in favor of GM management, And the ruling basically holds that employers should have an easier time firing or disciplining employees for, in their language, using language which is sexist or racist or otherwise abusive. In the case in point in question, this is the important piece of the story, is that this was a decision related to a case in which a black employee used what was racially insensitive language against a white manager. Something along the lines of the black employee did some sort of like caricature of shucking and jiving. Painting the manager as being a plantation owner. So this was a case of racism against a white person. To me, this speaks very broadly to the obvious consequence of the current culture and climate that we've seen coming from 100 miles away, which is that these restraints on speech that are being promulgated from folks on the left were always inevitably eventually going to be weaponized against people on the left, in this case workers. Right? I shouldn't say people on the left, the constituencies that the left...
Well, almost every American employee is an at-will employee, and they can be fired or laid off for any reason or any cause. So I'm not sure how significant this ruling is.
To care about.
What's interesting with this case is that what's been cited was that he did kind of caricatures of a slave, like, oh, you're kind of like, he was being treated as a slave, was the hyperbolic statement that he was making. And so they would make the argument that this was derogatory, right? Like, that the caricature of a slave should not be used so lightly, so on and so forth. It's derogatory towards African Americans, even though it was an African American person doing it, so on and so forth. So they almost like create kind of a general or globalized rule about certain types of language. And in this case, it was used against an employee or a worker who was part of kind of labor activism or rights, wages, conditions activism.
It actually, sorry to interrupt, but it actually says specifically in the piece that this was in the context of collective bargaining. So I imagine that it was probably at the bargaining table that this worker made this comment. So, I mean, it's one thing if on the job, in the course of your regular, just daily duties, you're making some kind of remark like that to your manager. Probably in any workplace, it would be relatively easy to fire somebody for that offense, which speaks to what, like, the question, which begs the question as to why the NLRB needs to, strengthen the rights of employers in this respect. But in this case, it was in some sort of bargaining context, and I'm guessing it was probably at the bargaining table, where this wasn't a worker reporting to management. This was a union member in a hostile bargaining session with management, and yet, so this is just clearly retaliation for union activity.
Yeah, I mean, there are like a few really awesome parts of this story. The Bloomberg piece about it makes a note of the fact that the ruling was done by the quote all-male, all-Republican 3-member panel, which is like, I mean, basically you had like 3 really woke Republicans, apparently woke Republicans, handing down this ruling, and like the statement from the NLRB chairman is like, I mean, it sounds like some kind of like great civil rights speech. He says, for too long, the board has protected employees who engage in obscene, racist, and sexually harassing speech not tolerated in almost any workplace today, which is, I mean, just hilarious hearing that. I mean, it's just so obviously like a cynical kind of usage of what they've been handed. I mean, they've essentially been handed this powerful weapon, right, by the like really identity obsessed, like woke left. And
well, what's interesting is, so I looked up, this was a set of cases from 2019 where the NLRB started looking for public comment on changing this rule. And they cited 3 cases where they had actually ruled in favor of the employees, and they said that basically they couldn't be retaliated against for these reasons. And so this is going to have some bad language, so I'm going to try to work around it. But at one point, an employee told a supervisor that the supervisor is an F-word crook. So that was one case where the NLRB ruled in favor of the employee, said, you're allowed to do that. In another case, I think an employee wrote a Facebook post about her supervisor saying something very, very similar to that, and then at the end of it, they said, vote yes for the union, so that was protected. And the third case was one where I think you could argue that maybe there was some racism employed, although even it's just a snippet of information. There were some replacement workers during a labor dispute, and one of the employees who was part of the labor dispute on the side of labor made some commentary about the food they eat, being fried chicken and watermelon or something. So like that one, you could probably argue was somewhat racially insensitive. But in all 3.
So I've never had a boyfriend, but I have 100 exes. The way that works is, like the first 2 weeks when you're seeing a guy, and it's kind of exciting because you're like, does he know my last name? Will we ever see each other again? I will be in that stage for 8 months. And that's something you think would be bad for somebody's self-worth, right? Okay, not with a positive twist. So let's say I'm seeing a guy, we are both at the same party, and he is ignoring me, not talking to me, not looking at me. I'm like, I love that he gives me space. And if we only go out once a month to a diner after having sex, I'm like, this is our spot. And if it's been over a year and I haven't met his family or his friends, I'm like, can you believe he's an orphan and I'm the only person he talks to? So sweet. I was seeing this guy for like 6 months, and it was great, except for he kept being like, I don't want a relationship, I can't commit to anything serious right now. And he kept like saying it and meaning it and being clear and communicative about his feelings. Very manipulative. Yeah. This guy, he also had erectile dysfunction, and I would never make fun of a man for anything. They deserve to be lifted up. But when he couldn't commit, it's like, was it not enough to disappoint just me? So I do need a boyfriend because I miss smoking weed. It's so hard, though. It's like, I've had so many weird experiences. When I first moved to New York, I started dating this guy who was like obsessed with getting me to sit on his face. Ladies, we all moved to New York. We date that guy. His name is Kyle. He's voracious. But I didn't want to do it because it feels like the only way for a guy to know how much you actually weigh. But he finally convinced me, which is how all sex should go. So, I'm sitting on his face, and I'm just sort of working at like a toilet in a public restroom. Just like, make contact, back up. I'm checking to make sure he's okay. I look down, and I see that his face is covered in blood. Yeah. So immediately I'm like, oh my God, I broke his nose with my thighs. Now I'm crying because I feel heavy. He was like, no, Rachel, like, you just got your period. But I was raised Catholic, so I don't even know guys knew about periods. I was like, who told you? And we have not seen each other since. I do think I like cured him of his fetish, though. I don't think he like asks girls to sit on his face anymore at all. Even though I've had some weird experiences, I like sex. I like sex. My dad is here. Hey. Yeah, I like to sex a lot. Do you guys like to sext? It's fine if you don't. Not everyone can be fucking cool. No, I like sexting, but I will say it does feel like sexting is just calling different body parts big or small. And it's like I always start strong and then run out of ideas. Like I'm like, oh, like me and my giant tits. You're gonna fuck me with your huge dick and my teeny tiny little girl pussy, and kiss me with your regular sized mouth. And then I'll suck your dick with my sharp, pointy teeth. I like kink stuff too. Do you guys like kink stuff? Weirdly, more people into kink stuff than sexting. Everyone's like, don't sext, BDSM, yes. Okay. Me and the last guy I was dating, we would do a lot of like kink stuff. He would tie me up, handcuff me to the bed, and I would always be like, watch out, like, one of these days, I'm gonna tie up you. Flirty. And I finally did it, and once you have a grown man tied up, there are just not a lot of options of things to do to his body, and none of them are pleasurable for you. He's just lying there like, I hope nobody sucks my dick. It's so sad, because I always like thought that I did stuff during sex, and then you like tie up the guy you're fucking, and you're like, oh no, I'm just being pulled places.
Okay, come on, that's pretty good. All right, I want to talk about tabloid journalism, tabloid tales. Quote here from former editor of the News of the World, the best-selling London newspaper for decades, would sell something like 7-8 million copies each week. Greg Miskew, this is what we do. We go out and destroy other people's lives. Kelvin Mackenzie, the long-serving editor of Rupert Murdoch's best-selling Sun tabloid, Daily Tabloid, was once asked what he thought about tabloid ethics. He replied, ethics, as far as I'm concerned, that's a place to the east of London where people wear white socks. So Greg Miskew says, what do? We go out, destroy other people's lives. Had Miskew's candid confession not been taped in vintage News of the World style, no one would ever have believed it. So I'm reading from a 2013 book by Paul Barry, Breaking News, Sex, Lies, and Murdoch Succession. Paul Barry, B-A-R-R-Y. He's an Australian author. But recording was proof he said it. If you thumbed through copies of the Murdoch Sunday Scandal Sheet, News of the World, published between 2000 and 2006, when Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson were editing the paper. Andy Coulson, this tabloid editor, he went on to be the head of communications for the British Prime Minister David Cameron. And Rebecca Brooks still runs the Rupert Murdoch's newspaper publishing corporation. Okay, you could see why he believed it. This is why the paper was often known as the news of the screws. Almost all of its big stories involved humiliating the famous for the joy of the masses by exposing celebrities, sports stars, and politicians for their illicit affairs, drunkenness, or homosexuality. But it was the style of these exposés as much as the content that made them so brutal, because Murdoch's weekly tabloid never showed any mercy to its hapless victims, whom it gleefully kicked, slapped, and ridiculed for the pleasure of its readers. Over the years, the News of the World won a number of newspaper awards for some remarkable scoops, like catching the Duchess of York selling access to the royal family, nailing 3 Pakistani cricketers for match fixing, or more controversially, revealing David Beckham's affair with his personal assistant, Rebecca Lewis. But most of its investigations had no public interest or importance, even though they undoubtedly packed a punch. And the paper's front page exclusive from July 2006 on gay pop star George Michael was a prime example. Headed George in New Sex Shame and written by the paper's chief reporter Neville Thorbeck, it began, mega rich pop star George Michael this week sank to new levels of depravity, trawling for illegal gay sex thrills in a London park. News of the World investigators caught the singer red-handed and red-faced as he emerged from the bushes after cavorting with a pot-bellied 58-year-old jobless van driver. Why is that news? Like, everybody does this. Thorbeck told the paper's readers in shocked tones that it was all in a public place and totally illegal. But a more honest description might have been that the unspecified acts had taken place in pitch dark, in thick undergrowth. Look, it's just people going into some thick undergrowth for some anonymous gay sex, and then the bloody tabloids show up. How inconvenient is that? At 3 o'clock in the morning, when everyone apart from the paper's fearless investigative team was fast asleep. George Michael's depraved behavior had in fact been so private that even the paper's staffers with their powerful telephoto lens had been unable to see what he was doing. Public decency had been offended. It was only because Thorbeck and Miskew and their editor Andy Carlson had chosen to put it all on the front page of the paper. Typically, the News of the World also failed to mention that it had only got this story because its crack reporters had sat outside the singer's house for several hours or perhaps days before following his car at 1 a.m. to Hampstead Heath. Look, the poor singer, he'd just gone to Hampstead Heath to nice, lovely private park there for some anonymous gay sex, and these bloody tabloid journos, they're cramping his style, where they shadowed him for 2 hours until he finally scored. But this was how the paper's fearless sleuths habitually spent their time, not content with exposing George Michael's midnight meanderings. The reporting team had also followed the man they described as a pot-bellied 58-year-old jobless van driver 100 kilometers back to Brighton so they could push their way into his flat, bully him into a quote about the Star, and report that his dingy place was littered with rubbish, dirty crockery, and filthy laundry, and that his only companion was a 20-year-old cat. Okay, so don't be like these blokes. Be like this bloke.
So, we have a tendency to say, all of them Yimach Shemam. The ones who should be Yimach Shemam are the ones who deserve it. And not everybody deserves it. Remember Rachav, who saved the Meraglim, the spies that Yeshua sent out. She wasn't Jewish.
So, talking about the book of Joshua, and the woman who let the spies in was a prostitute, according to the text.
Jewish either. And if you take the word literally, she was a lady of the night. And the Medrash turns around and says that she actually married Yeshua. So, we have to be careful about these things. And it was kind of a lesson that I had learned. And finally, in my probably the most difficult time I had in the Pentagon was when I was asked to look into an Israeli airplane called the Levi. Now, the Israelis were using American money to build this plane. And the father of the plane was Moshe Ahrens, who had been defense minister at the time. He was minister without portfolio. And my father knew his father. Knew his father quite well, actually worked with his father. So it was an awkward moment. And I told my boss, part of my job was to be a fixer, like with the Falklands War, with other things. And so my boss asked me to look into this. Weinberger had his concerns about the plane. And my boss said, what's going on? So I start looking into it, and I discover that the Israelis were giving us old data, 3-year-old data. Now, I happen to be a program analyst by training, an economist and program analyst, and I knew that didn't fly.
And
so
an Orthodox rabbi.
Put together a team, worked very closely with Yitzchak Rabin on this, who had his doubts. The chief staff of the Air Force.
So the prestigious position of head of Yeshiva University was offered to this man, and he turned it down.
Avihu bin Nun also had doubts. And of course, the head of the Army had doubts, and the head of the Navy had doubts. And the reason was there was concern that that all the money that would go into this plane would essentially take away all the money from any other project Israel could come up with. Now, Ahrens was convinced that he could get more money out of the Congress. But that wasn't really the case at all. And in the meantime, other developments were being essentially held up. Everybody said, well, Weinberger was an anti-Semite, and that's why he hated the plane. That's why he hated Israel. But the Israelis were also, at the very same time, the Israeli Navy wanted to develop a new submarine that could fire missiles. And of course, if the money went to the plane, they wouldn't develop the submarine. The submarine's called the Dolphin. They still use it, and the missiles they fire are missiles that threaten Iran. The Levi could never have threatened Iran. Weinberger said, okay. He said, look into that one too. And eventually he supported the program. But for me, the challenge was, here I was, an Orthodox Jew, and sure enough, my family was harassed. My children in summer camp were told their father was a traitor. One person in shul, in front of my small children, said I should be carried out in a coffin. It was not a very pleasant time. at the end of the day, the Israeli cabinet voted to kill the plane, and the money went not only to buy, frankly, a much better plane, the F-16, but also supported the satellite program, the submarine program, the Merkava tank program, and basically allowed Israel to expand into the high-tech sector in a way they never could have done. But as an Orthodox Jew, let me tell you, I wouldn't wish this on other Orthodox Jews. When I left the Pentagon, I had a whole bunch of senior contacts, and those proved useful because one of the people I was working with as a consultant, and even at the time I was also a consultant to the Pentagon, turned out to be a man named Elmo Zumwalt. Bud Zumwalt, the former chief of naval operations, was very, very pro-Israel and very pro-Jewish. And I went into his office because his office was 2 doors down from mine, and I said, Bud, there's no Jewish chapel at the Naval Academy. So he called the superintendent of the Naval Academy, who happened to be somebody I knew as well, and I went to see him. And he also called the current, at the time, chief of naval operations, who also supported it. So the Navy was for it. The question was how to raise the money. I'm not a fundraiser. That's just not my thing.
Outrageous. Did you guys know that this naval installation, this naval base, it had no Jewish chapel? It's outrageous. God, my blood pressure is just skyrocketing thinking about it. Like my pulse is just, my pulse, you know what my pulse is doing right now? My pulse is pulsating because I am so upset at this news that this naval installation had no Jewish chapel. Whoa, look at my pulse. It's 67. My pulse is 67. It's just off the charts. Typically, the News of the World also failed to mention that it only got this story because its crack reporters had sat outside the singer's house, da-da-da. Okay, 2 weeks earlier, the News of the World had featured another Neville Thorbeck story titled Randy Andy's Teeny Weeny Tartan Hanky Spanky, which revealed that the former Scottish soccer star Andy Gray might be a giant among TV pundits, but was a midget in the bedroom. The exclusive Kiss and Tell interview with his Italian ex-lover, Diana Franco, highlighted his pot belly and small penis. The sex was always awful, she told the paper, no doubt for a suitable fee, adding that lovemaking would only last a couple of minutes, then he would roll over and go to sleep. A couple of minutes? Who is this Superman? Wow. 2 minutes? Previous issue had boasted a similar exclusive on the star of the trip and I'm Alan Partridge, which began, the secret lover of comic Steve Coogan last night dumped him and branded him a sick pervert addicted to warped sex, hookers, cocaine, and Viagra. Pretty Victoria Venegas sobbed, he's one of the most depraved men I've ever met. I'll be ashamed of the disgusting things he made me do for the rest of my life. My God, I hope I never get famous so that the ladies are left behind. Oh, I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear. I don't want my intimate details splayed all over for the public's amusement. The long-suffering Ms. Venegas, whose hard time with the actor was perhaps now being compensated for by a substantial payment from the News of the World, sobbed that she had whipped him, slapped him, and performed a bizarre sex act too disgusting to mention in a family newspaper. But she did not explain why she had stuck around for 2 years if she found it all so abhorrent. Yet another story that July took aim at comic Russell Brand with an exclusive headed, Russell Brandy, 3 a.m. he beds Kimberly, 12 p.m. he smooches Sadie. And naturally, the Screws also brought its readers up to date on the royal family with another exclusive titled Flirty Harry Tried to Do Dirty With Me, which announced that a pretty masseuse has told how Prince Harry couldn't keep his hands off her after she gave him a sexy rub down. Most of these stories, and there were 3 or 4 in every issue, read like a private eye parody of the genre and would have been funny had real people not been involved. But the targets of these tawdry tales were clearly of no concern to the paper's journalists, who obviously believed they deserved to have their reputations ruined, if only because they were richer and more famous than their readers. And the News of the World proprietor, Rupert Murdoch, made it clear that he also had no problems with this collateral damage. Back in the 1980s, when The Sun was running a series of scandalous and unsubstantiated stories on Elton John, Rupert was famously confronted by one of Britain's popular breakfast TV presenters, Anne Diamond, who asked him, "How do you sleep at night knowing that your papers ruin people's lives?" It was just water off a duck's back, Diamond later recalled. He looked at me and said, "I don't ruin people's lives, they ruin their lives." And those were his values. If you somehow get into his newspapers, it's your fault. This was doubtless a legacy of Rupert Murdoch's Puritan upbringing. His father was a Protestant preacher. His mother was the child of a dissolute, degenerate gambler. But these people were sinners, so they deserved their fate. 3 weeks after the encounter with Rupert, Diamond discovered that Murdoch's tabloids were after her too when The Sun splashed news that she was having an affair with her producer, whom she later married. Not long after that, the paper ran a front-page story, "Anne Diamond killed my father," dredging up a 7-year-old road accident in which a man had died. Diamond, who was driving one of the cars involved in the collision, had been exonerated at the inquest. "I was utterly terrified," she said of her reaction to the headline. "I thought the world would believe I was a murderer." It was of little comfort to the personable TV host that Britain's press council later ruled The Sun's article to be an irresponsible and grievous intrusion into privacy, found the headline wholly misleading, because having run the original story across page 1, the paper buried its apology to Diamond down near the bottom of an inside page.
Guy comes in to see me, and he says to me, "I can raise the money. I've already raised money to support Jewish midshipmen at the academy. There's a Jewish midshipmen's club. I can raise the money for this chapel." So I said, "Wonderful. I'll do whatever I can to help you." He says to me, "But there's one catch." I said, "What's the catch?" He said, "My wife isn't Jewish." I said to him, "Look, you build that chapel, and Jewish midshipmen and midship women, they're also called midshipmen, marry and identify as Jewish, your place in Gan Eden is there ahead of mine." The guy raised the money. And I would encourage anybody who visits Washington to make a side trip to Annapolis and see this chapel. It's part of the Navy's, one of the Navy's buildings. It's not a building on its own. It is, the Aron Kodesh is made of Jerusalem stone. It has a balcony so that if you want to have an Orthodox.
Okay, thank God.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Chicago is the third biggest city in the United States. Millions of people live there. For 150 years, it was the hub of America's manufacturing economy. If any one place can credibly claim to have built this country, it's Chicago. So we should care what happens there. Unfortunately, what is happening now in Chicago is almost all bad. In fact, it's a disaster. Thanks to the corruption of local officials, Chicago is bankrupt. The city is so deeply in debt, billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars in debt, that no economist believes it can ever pay its bills. Taxpayers know this. They understand they will be punished for the crimes of their leaders, so they're fleeing the city in record numbers. Those who've stayed behind now worry about getting killed. Just this week, so far, 106 people have been shot in Chicago. Just an hour after last night's show, for example, 6 people were shot in one drive-by shooting on the city's south side. 2 of them died. And it's not just happening in poor neighborhoods in Chicago. Here's surveillance video of gunmen opening fire downtown. 2 people were hit by bullets, 1 was killed. Among many others murdered in Chicago have been many, many children. This man's first grader, for example, was shot in the head.
To see my daughter on the table with a gunshot wound to the forehead.
7-year-old Natalia Wallace was shot in the head and killed over the weekend in Chicago as she played outside with her siblings.
Visualize the 7-year-old shot, bleeding to death while the family is there.
Also among the innocent victims, police say 14-year-old Fernando Jones was shot and killed by gang members on the 4th of July.
It's awful. Chicago wasn't always like this, and if you're from there, you know that very well. Chicago was a beautiful place. There are a lot of reasons it isn't anymore, but near the top of that list is a woman called Lori Lightfoot. She's the mayor. Like a lot of big city mayors, Lightfoot is incompetent. She has no idea what she's doing. You wouldn't let her plan your spring break. She'd send you to Wuhan by accident. But what makes Lori Lightfoot unusual is the remarkably aggressive way that she lies. Lightfoot says things that are so implausible they could be part of a comedy routine, but she's not joking. She expects you to believe every word of it. Here she is, for example, blaming violence in Chicago on, of all people, Republicans.
Why are we engaged in such violence? Because there are too many damn guns on our streets. And why is that so? Because the Republican leadership for way too long, including this president, refuses to even have a conversation about common sense gun reform.
See? It's the Republicans' fault that Chicago is now more dangerous than many third world countries. That makes sense. The only problem is there aren't really any Republicans in Chicago. Donald Trump got 12% of the vote there. Of the 50 aldermen on Chicago's city council right now, not a single one of them is a Republican, not one. So if you blame Republicans for what's happening in, say, West Texas or at the Villages, you might have a point. But in Chicago, it's absurd. Even Lori Lightfoot seems to know that that excuse just won't work. It's too stupid. So she's moved on to a new excuse. You know why Chicago is circling the drain right now? You know why all those children are getting murdered? Because of Christopher Columbus. Yes. An Italian navigator who never got within 1,000 miles of the loop and who, by the way, died more than 500 years ago. He did it. It's Columbus's fault. This morning, Lightfoot ordered the city to take down 2 Christopher Columbus statues, one in Little Italy and one in Grant Park. That'll fix the problem. You can let your kids play outside now. Confusing on one level, though, in case you're wondering why Lightfoot chose Christopher Columbus to blame for our city's decline. Why not Marco Polo? Why not Vasco da Gama? Well, there's a reason. Her constituents demanded it. Not voters or taxpayers. There was never any groundswell of opposition to Christopher Columbus in Chicago. He's not on the list of present concerns for most people there. No. Lightfoot's actual constituents wanted Columbus taken down. Her actual constituents are Antifa. Last week, the mob descended on Grant Park to rip down the Columbus statue. Almost 50 police officers were injured in the riot you just saw, but Lori Lightfoot didn't care. They're not her voters. Lightfoot cares about her base, the looters, the destroyers, the angry Marxist rich kids with the spray paint. When they tell her to act, Lori Lightfoot acts immediately. The problem for the rest of us is the mobs will not stop with Christopher Columbus. He's just the beginning. If they can tear down statues whenever they feel like it, how long before they tear down buildings? How long before they tear down homes? How long before they tear down human beings? Probably not very long. Violence rarely remains symbolic. It accelerates until good people rise up to stop it. If Lori Lightfoot and progressive mayors like her around the country, and there are many, are allowed to divert attention from their own failures by bowing to the mob and destroying public property, this will not end with Christopher Columbus. It will get much worse, and it will get more dangerous. You may not think tearing down a statue is a big deal until you are the next designated Christopher Columbus. Bob Woodson has studied American cities for decades. He founded the Woodson Center. We're honored to have him on tonight. Mr. Woodson, thanks so much for coming on. I see a theme here, and it's not just Lori Lightfoot, it's many big city mayors and even smaller city mayors. As the problems they face become more complex and harder to solve, their solutions seem to become more frivolous and more disconnected from reality. Have you noticed?
Okay, so the Democrats have posted their platform, and it's pretty simple. As Steve Salen notes, Democratic platform to white people: we hate you. The message to whites: you guys are the bad guys. Here are all the mentions of whites in the draft document. They are all negative. We will never amplify or legitimize the voices of bigotry, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or white supremacy. Median incomes are lower and poverty rates are higher for Black Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and some Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders compared to median white households. And there is a persistent, pernicious racial wealth gap that holds millions of Americans back, with a typical white household holding 6 times more wealth than the typical Latino family and 10 times more wealth than the typical Black family. The wage gap between Black workers and white workers is higher today than it was 20 years ago. Takes a typical black woman 19 months to earn what a typical white man earns in 12 months. And for typical Latinas and Native American women, it takes almost 2 years. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the uninsured rate was nearly 3 times higher for Latinos, nearly twice as high for black Americans as it was for whites. Some segments of the Asian American and Pacific Islander population faced uninsured rates rivaling those of black Americans and Latinos, and more than 1 in 5 Native Americans and Alaska Natives were uninsured. Black children are far more likely than white children to suffer from asthma. So due to systemic white racism, guys. Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and black Americans are diagnosed with diabetes at higher rates than whites. Why? Because of white racism. Average life expectancy is more than 2 years lower for rural Americans compared to those who live in metropolitan areas. Don't tell this to Elliot Blatt. Black women are more than 3 times as likely to die from complications of pregnancy and childbirth compared to white women because of white racism. President Trump's words and actions have given safe harbor and encouragement to bigots, anti-Semites, Islamophobes, and white supremacists. The extreme gap in household wealth and income between people of color, especially black Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, and white families is hurting our working class and holding our country back. We will confront white nationalist terrorism and combat hate crimes perpetrated against religious minorities. Each year, the United States spends $23 billion more on schools in predominantly white districts than in non-white districts. We will root out systemic racism from our military justice system, where black service members are twice as likely as white ones to face court-martial. Who knew? Well, the people of Okinawa. They know about this. They are tired of Okinawan women getting raped by a certain group of American service members. Our counterterrorism priorities, footprint, and tools should shift accordingly, including to respond to the growing threat from white supremacist and other right-wing terrorist groups. The only thing, as Steve Saylor, that can unify the Democrats' diversity is essentially hatred of whites. But can an anti-white coalition survive megalomania on the part of one of the groups? Well, say one of the groups let the Democrats be the anti-straight white male party, or will they demand the Democrats be the people of color and miscellaneous party? So not a lot of love for white people in the Democratic platform. So the Democrats have essentially become the party of black grievance and black anger, and Republicans have become the party of white interests. Who would have thought?
Agents within the highest crime area has gone now 65 days without a single violent incident because they address their problems by mobilizing the internal resources, the resilience, the self-determination of people inside. And so we've demonstrated that islands of peace can be created if you stop looking externally and stop listening to the left, and instead listening to the people and give them the power to be agents of their own uplift and stop these hustlers from exploiting them, like Lori Lightfoot.
And it is about the power of the Democratic Party. That's all it's about. It's all it's ever about, of course. Mr. Whitson, thank you. Great to see you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Anthony Fauci has demanded that you wear a mask. He wants you to back off from the people you know and love. He wants you to stop shaking hands. Not all of Dr. Fauci's advice comports with known science. Dave Portnoy, who runs Barstool Sports, asked the president recently about Anthony Fauci in an interview at the White House. Here's how it went.
So Fauci is on my X list because every time he talks and says the country should stay inside, my stocks tank. So I don't like that aspect of it.
No, he'd like to see it closed up for a couple of years, but that's okay because I'm president. So I say, well, I appreciate your opinion. Now give me another opinion, somebody, please.
Overruled, yeah.
So Fauci took a day off from giving advice to the powerful and lecturing the nation yesterday. He was busy throwing out the first pitch at the Nationals game, the baseball game in Washington. But once Dr. Fauci thought he was off camera, the mask came off literally. Want to see hypocrisy in action? Look at this. Here's Dr. Fauci sitting within 6 feet of other people in a mostly empty stadium without wearing his mask. Ooh. Well, he was immediately called on this, but rather than copping to it and being honest, he acted like so many people in power do and scorned anyone criticizing him. Watch.
I think this is sort of mischievous with this thing going around. I had my mask around my chin. I had taken it down. I was totally dehydrated, and I was drinking water, trying to rehydrate myself. And by the way, I was negative COVID literally the day before. So I guess people want to make a big of that. I wear a mask all the time when I'm outside. To pull it down, to take some sips of water and put it back up again. I guess if people want to make something about that, they can.
Oh, if people want to make a thing of it, if people want to make a fetish of masks, people are worried about COVID. Lighten up, America. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. You're Dr. Anthony Fauci? You're one of the reasons our economy is ground to a halt? You're one of the reasons that people are as unhappy as they've ever been? Were you just 4 minutes ago lecturing us about how we're immoral if we don't wear masks, but when you do it, it's totally cool because you've got good excuses. You were thirsty. No, you were laughing with your friends. We bet that Dr. Fauci won't have to pay the $1,000 fine that the District of Columbia is now imposing on citizens who don't wear masks in public. Here's the mayor of Washington, air quotes are on that word, Muriel Bowser, announcing the policy. Watch.
I am also today signing a new mayor's order on masks. And basically what it says is if you leave home, you should wear a mask. This means if you're waiting for a bus, you must have on a mask. If you are ordering food at a restaurant, you must have on a mask. If you're sitting in a cubicle in an open office, you must have on a mask.
Until the day Joe Biden wins the presidential election, you, Mr. and Mrs. America, must wear masks. Unless, of course, you're the people who wrote the mask ordinance in D.C., the politicians, they exempted themselves. Oh, because they've suspended the rules of science because they're in power and you're not. So shut up and obey until Biden wins. That's the rule. Masks for thee, but not for me. Well, a secretive Pentagon unit that has been studying unidentified flying objects for decades is now divulging some of its secrets. And it turns out some of them are a big deal. A retired naval aviator who has seen unidentifying flying objects joins us next.
Okay, here's this Trump interview with
this is the
Bahrain Sports.
President's desk, very famous desk, actually. Many presidents have sat behind this desk. Good stuff, right? We're just saying, nothing like the White House. You know, it's the whole deal, right? How are you? Good to meet you. Okay, I'm over to you. Thanks, Dan.
All right. So we good to go here, Frankie? Should I wait for you?
Yeah, Frankie, you want to come to it?
Your son's a big fan of our website.
He's a big fan of you, yeah.
I've tried to get, even before this started, I was trying to get a retweet out of him for about 6 months.
Well, we'll do that.
He kept, well, you got me on one,
We'll
but he'd
do that.
DM me, I'd be like, get the old man to get a retweet and get the numbers up. We'll talk business.
Well, you're doing pretty well in that.
Yeah, so are you.
Yeah, we are. We have good numbers.
So I consider myself, believe it or not, apolitical. I don't consider myself wildly Republican, Democrat, kind of down in the middle. In fact, this is my first interview I've ever done. So I started at the top.
You started very well. That's good.
And I was going to give you the heads up. I don't know if you can remember this. You once were on Ali G's show, and you were the only one that sniffed out that was a fake interview in the whole thing. I don't know if you remember that. That's right. I thought maybe you'd be like, oh, this guy's a fake. Anyway,
now, were you involved with that show in some way?
No, not at all. I just watched it on TV.
But you're right. I was the only one.
30 seconds in and out. I know.
I said, hey, this guy's a total fraud, and I left.
And everyone else sits there for 6 hours. I know.
You're the only one that's ever given me credit for that.
That was a very sharp move because
Well,
he's pretty good at that. He gets everybody.
I like this interview. No matter what he does, I like this interview now, Mariana. That's right. I said, what's going on with this guy? And I just felt it was a phony deal.
Yeah.
And
nobody else did it. Nobody else smelled it out.
And he said he was from British Broadcasting Corporation. They called up with everything beautiful, the voice. This is British Broadcast. And then this guy shows up. I said, this is but within a very short, like immediately, And thank you very much. You gave me
On it.
because I
Good.
never get credit for anything.
I'm
Dave.
pretty good. That's what I'm saying.
You're pretty good.
And here's part of it, which and I hate politics. My dad loves politics. The thing that drives me nuts is I feel like for us, which is good,
Right.
they're like, hey Dave, you're a snowflake. Hey Dave, you're a conservative, like crazy person. And almost on each side, you can predict what somebody's going to say, which drives me nuts. It's
Yeah.
like you put it in a box. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and for all the people like me, which is I think a good amount of the country is still like, which way am I going to vote?
Right.
One of the things that I have a question for, and again, I think it matters. I'm very curious on the answer. So when the Kaepernick thing started, I was critical of it. And as it's continued, baseball players now, I heard you say, if they kneel, you'll turn the game off.
Yeah.
And we got the Black Lives Matter protests. So for me, it's like, how does somebody who's dissatisfied, in your world, what's the way for them to show it? Because we don't want them looting and doing all the stuff they're doing. To me, that's like a silent protest that is far better than going out the streets and create crime. So
Right.
I'm curious, what would you do if you had an issue with the country or something to show your displeasure?
Well, I mean, you can always say you run for office, right? You become successful. You can run for a lower office. You can do things. But there are ways you get groups together, and they can be very friendly ways of doing it, very successful. I mean, you're going to have rebounds, negative rebounds, if it keeps up the way it is. Like, as an example, Portland, this is crazy. 51 days, we sent in very powerful, not military, but very strong people. The police are good, but they were told not to do anything, by the radical left mayor. No, you have to go out and you have to say, and speak your mind is good. I think speaking your mind is good, but you have to do it fairly. We are for justice, but we're for law and order. It's got to be law and order, and there is law and order. I put something out when they were starting to rip down
You can have an
statues.
Orthodox service. It has a museum of Jews and naval history. It wasn't just Commodore Levy, who was a leading Jew in the history of the Navy. It's a huge Kiddush Hashem. Not only that, there's a cupola in front of the chapel, and on the ceiling is glass shaped as a Magen David, so that anybody who flies over the United States Naval Academy will see a Magen David on the campus of the academy. I'm pretty proud of being behind that. Probably the most important thing I've done in my life. When I went back to the Pentagon under Don Rumsfeld, one of the things I noticed during the campaign, I was one of what were called the Vulcans. There was a group of us. Condi Rice was our head. We had Paul Wolfowitz was there, who became Deputy Secretary of Defense. Bob Zellick, who wound up heading the World Bank. Steve Hadley, who wound up National Security Advisor. There was 7 of us. We met one time in Stanford, and Condi knew that I kept Shabbos, so everybody was at a hotel. She found me a place actually on campus. We also had some subcommittees, and one of them was headed by Don Rumsfeld. And we met in his house. It's not really a house; it was like a triplex apartment in Chicago, near the lake, Lakeshore Drive there. And I noticed that 2 floors below was a house with a big mezuzah on it. And I thought to myself, not everybody who lives like Don Rumsfeld would want to live in a house.
Sightings, including a 2004 encounter recorded from an advanced Navy fighter jet. Commander David Fravor is a retired naval aviator who once saw something he could not explain, that science can't explain. We're honored to have him on tonight. Mr. Fravor, thanks so much for coming on. So, tell us if you think this is being misinterpreted. According to the New York Times, the U.S. government has physical evidence of some sort of vehicle made not on this earth. Is it what it sounds like?
Well, it sounds that way to me, Tucker. I just, I never want to speculate what the government truly has, but I would say there's stuff out there. I mean, the 4 of us that chased the Tic Tac in 2004 have attested to it multiple times that what we saw exceeded anything that we had in our inventory, far superior to the airplanes that we were flying in at the time.
Okay, I think that's ridiculous. Let's go back to this patriotic American.
Where you see a mezuzah on one of the other doors. Rumsfeld was very, very good that way. Never had issues with Shabbos. In fact, when I was the first guy he hired, he gets announced and he comes into D.C. and he meets with me in the Four Seasons Hotel. And, he says to me, I said to him, what would you like me to do? I could be undersecretary for the policy or the budget, the comptroller or technology, whatever. He said, I want you to be the budget guy because the budget is policy. I said, fine. And then I said, I'm not going to work on Saturday. And he says, yeah, that's okay. So I felt guilty. And I said to him, the Jewish law is if life is endangered on Saturday, of course I'll work. So he goes, well, it's the Pentagon. Life's always in danger on Saturday, every Saturday. I said to him, I'm not talking about nonsensical meetings. Well, Of course, I didn't go in. I had a deputy. I used to send the deputy to the meetings that took place on Saturday till 9/11. 9/11, we're in a very different place. And for the first time in my life, I'm working on Friday night. I managed to avoid coming in on Shabbos, but once I was in the office on a Friday and papers were coming in and things that I had to sign, and I'd never signed anything on Shabbos in my life. It was an out-of-body experience, but I couldn't just walk away because if something got delayed or if my deputy wasn't senior enough to get something approved, and God forbid somebody got killed because they didn't get the right piece of equipment, I'd never get over it. My staff, none of whom was Jewish, used to tell me how horrible they felt because I always used to leave home for Shabbos, and now I wasn't leaving. And in fact, on Shemini Atzeres, I remember, it was the first time I actually worked during the day. Now, undersecretaries of defense have a car and a driver. So the car picked me up, takes me to the Pentagon. Coming home, I realized I could make mincha. So the car took me to shul, to daven mincha. And I told the rabbi, this was my day of 3 firsts. I had never worked on a yontif before. I had never gone to shul before with a car, and I had never made mincha in time like I had that day. So being an undersecretary, you're quite senior. Basically, you're the 3rd level. There's the secretary, there's this deputy secretary, and then there are a group of us who were undersecretaries. At the time, there were only 4 of us. Now there are 6. There's great creep in the federal government like there is in academia. And so one of the things that Rumsfeld had me do, in addition to being in charge of the budget, was to be the coordinator of funding, international funding and international troop contributions, both to Afghanistan, where I was the civilian coordinator, and Iraq. Well, one time, the defense minister of Iraq comes to the Pentagon, and they had agreed that, not Iraq, excuse me, Poland, and they had agreed that Poland would send a brigade to Iraq. And Rumsfeld told the minister, Zakheim will work it out with you guys. So I go to Poland, and as it happened, my older son Chaim had some business in Warsaw at the same time. I started out in Krakow. No, I started out in Warsaw, actually, and then I had to go down to Krakow. He was still in Warsaw. While I was in Krakow, they took me to Auschwitz. But they didn't take me to Birkenau. Why Auschwitz? Because Auschwitz also has a lot of Polish dead. And the Poles have always made a big deal. It wasn't just the Jews who were killed. So they wanted me to see all of that. The other thing they would do is whenever I went, and wherever they gave me something, we went to a restaurant, whatever, where I had something to eat, if there was a piano, they would always play Sunrise Sunset from Fiddler on the Roof. It was like, oh, he's a Jew. We have to play Sunrise Sunset. In fact, when I left to go back to the States, the National Security Advisor turned out to be a quarter Jewish himself. Gave me 2 things. He gave me a yad for laning, and he gave me a bottle of Fiddler vodka, which had a cap. When you opened it, it played Sunrise Sunset. Mela, my son and I hooked up together, and because I also had to sign an agreement, I signed the agreement with the Poles, I had to sign another one with the Lithuanians. So we fly up together. Actually, it was on the plane of the president of Poland. He later was killed on that plane when it exploded. Thank God it didn't explode when I was on it. And we get to Vilna, and one of the things they want to show me is Panari Forest. So my son tagged along. I was in front of the line with the minister. He was the last guy there. I mean, he was the tag along. I don't know if any of you have been to Panari Forest. If you've been to Panari Forest, you'll see there's these big vats. And what they used to do, what the Nazis used to do, is get all the Jews to stand on the edge of the vats, shoot them, and get the next line of Jews to straighten all the dead Jews out and then shoot them. And there was a railway line. There was a railway line that there's nobody here to answer the phone, so I'm sorry, it's an interruption.
Call from Firestone Payment.
Oh, no, it's my brother-in-law. He can wait.
Call from Firestone Payment.
Reminds me, one time I was speaking in front of several thousand people, and I got this, my cell phone went off, and I picked it up and I said, oh, it's only Rumsfeld, and I put it down. Anyway, so there's this railway line, and what they used to do is they would take the Jews from the ghettos, put them on the cattle cars, and the railway would stop by the vats where they would herd the Jews off and go through the killings. Well, I heard a train coming, and my reaction was, they're bringing Jews. Afterwards, my son said to me, did you hear that train coming? I said, sure. He said, I felt like they were bringing Jews. There is something, I've been to the Latvian forest as well. There's blood in the ground there. There's blood in the trees. You feel it like, even worse almost than going to visit a concentration camp, because the trees are still there. The railway line is still there. The sky is still there. Everything is normal. And you know that this is what they did to thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Jews. It really got to me in a very big way. Another time when I was in Poland, I was a guest of the defense minister. And what they used to do, they had this fabulous guest house. I think it belonged to Graf Potocki. If you're familiar with the name Graf Potocki, a lot of Jewish stories about it. There's a whole family called Potocki, very wealthy counts. And they had mansions all over, 2 of them in Warsaw, mansions all over what was then Poland, including what's now Ukraine. Anyway, I had this house all to myself because I was the only guest. One time when I led the delegation to sign the agreement with the Poles, there were a whole bunch of us in the guest house, which made sense. It was a mansion, so everybody had a room to themselves. I had this whole mansion to myself. The first morning I'm there, this very tall Polish guy, I mean, out of central casting from Poland, a blonde crew cut, blue eyes like the sky, tall, thin, and he comes and brings me breakfast. And there's meat plates. And I'm looking at the meat, and I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, all right, I'm not going to eat this stuff. And he sees me staring at the meat, and he goes, it's glatt kosher, it's under hashgacha. You could have knocked me over with a feather. So being a senior person, you really have to think about what are the halachas? What can you do, what you cannot do? And Rabbi Kelman mentioned Nehemiah, because that started out as my model. You know, Nehemiah
Nehemiah
was the wine
book
taster
of Nehemiah in the Bible.
And the question was, how could he taste the wine for Artaxerxes? It was, you know, even if it wasn't yayin nesach used for religious purposes, it was still stam yain.
So an observant Jew is not allowed to drink non-kosher wine. So the book of Nehemiah in English, he served the Persian king Darius. He would test his wine. This is the discussion.
And the rabbis say that ordinary wine you're not supposed to drink. It's touched by a non-Jew. It's not like nowadays where so many kosher wines are yayin mavushal, and you know that's the way around it. If you cook it, it's okay. It wasn't cooked in those days. It didn't have the OU, and of course he was allowed to do this. And so the rabbi said in the Gemara that the reason he was allowed was because he was dealing with malchus. In other words, he was a government official, and government officials, it turns out, and I did some research on this, and you can actually read the product of that. Go to the website of the Institute of Jewish Ideas and Ideals. They produced a journal called Conversations, and some years ago, I wrote an article called, here's the title, Practicing Jews Serving in the National Security Community, Modalities and Challenges. We're dealing, of course, with the possibility of pikuach nefesh. And so the question becomes, how far up the chain do you have to be where you're a sufficiently senior decision maker that as a government official and as somebody whose decisions might affect literally life and death. And remember, I mean, one could argue that even if the entire military was non-Jewish, you would do it, Mishum Eva or Mishum Darkei Shalom, just to keep the peace. It doesn't matter. But as it happens, our military does have practicing Jews. We've actually had, most people don't know this, we've had generals that were senior to the most senior general in the Israeli army. The most senior general in the Israeli army is the chief of staff, what's called the Ramatkal. Chief of staff is a 3-star, a lieutenant general. We have had 2 Jewish 4-stars. We've had Bob Magnus, who was the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps. People don't normally associate Marines with Jews, but he was the number 2 of the Marine Corps, a 4-star general, a decorated pilot. And we also had Nordy Schwartz, who was the chief of staff of the United States Air Force. Chief of staff of the Israeli Air Force is a 2-star. Chief of staff of the American Air Force is a 4-star. And he grew up in a conservative family, conservative household. I think he went to Camp Ramah. He certainly was involved in USY, and he made it to the top of the Air Force. So we have Jews in the military. So pikuach nefesh
Small
is
group
not
of
just
highly privileged people seem to get more powerful and increase the crackdown on the country. But occasionally there are reversals of fortune that we want to call attention to. Today was a day like that. The Washington Post has settled a $250 million defamation suit brought by Nicholas Sandman. He's the high school kid from Covington Catholic in Kentucky. He was vilified by the media, you'll remember. They selectively edited a video of him. They made it sound like he was harassing an American Indian man. In fact, the full video showed the exact opposite of that. We reached out to the Washington Post today, its media reporter, Eric Wempel, and we asked him to come on and explain the Washington Post's role in this. He was, of course, too cowardly to do that. Loathsome. But it wasn't just the Washington Post, by the way, that attacked these kids for the crime of, we're not sure what the crime was. Here was Don Lemon over on CNN describing the encounter.
The MAGA hat carries a certain connotation that provokes a conditioned reaction from many people, especially from marginalized people.
Got that? So international TV star Don Lemon wants you to know that if someone disagrees with his politics, you're allowed to harass them. Maybe even beat them up. Who knows? Salmon sued for that, too, and CNN settled a $275 million case earlier this year. But it would be a mistake to say it was just the Washington Post and just CNN. It was NBC, too.
Do you feel from this experience that you owe anybody an apology? Do you see your own fault? We looked at that video and thought about how it felt from the other's perspective. In other words, there were a lot of you, a handful of the others. There's something aggressive about standing there.
Every single day, these people bully Americans, yell at them, berate them, attack them, force them from their jobs. The country's cowering in silence thanks to people like this, but occasionally somebody fights back, and even more occasionally someone fights back and wins. And that's what Nicholas Sandmann did today. Robbie Suave is the author of Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. He was the first to expose the smear against Sandmann and his classmates, and so we thought it'd be worth having him back tonight. Robbie, thanks so much for coming on. What's your reaction to this, since you've been on this since the first day?
I'm really glad that there has been recognition from these couple of journalistic institutions that have been sued that they did get it wrong. I'm glad, Sandmann is getting a measure of justice. What I hope is that it will send a message. Now, I'm not confident this message will be received, but my hope would be that this would send a message to others in the media that you have to practice the craft of journalism. You have to be careful about stories if a clip, a video like this emerges involving non-important people, non-public people, and it's not clear what's going on, and you just race to smear someone where you're not aware of the facts of the situation as a racist, and that's wrong. That goes against norms of journalism to seek the full story. Or to even just consider the newsworthiness of, like, this wasn't newsworthy. There was no reason to do this story. So I want that to set in, that we don't need to always do a story about someone wore a bad Halloween costume 5 years ago or sent a homophobic tweet when they were 14 or something. I mean, in Sandmann's case, there really was no wrongdoing whatsoever. But the other kind, the drive to cancel or smear or attack normal, regular people who aren't famous or important and that really needs to change. So I hope this could be a step in that direction. I'm not confident it will be.
I hope it is. Here, the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, his personal newspaper, attacking high school kids? For what? So it's nice to see this, I will say. Robbie, great to see you. Thank you. We should say that neither the Washington Post nor Sandmann disclosed the value of today's settlement. Jeff Bezos can afford all of it, of course. Jason Whitlock writes for and is a part owner of a fantastic site called Outkick. He joins us tonight. Jason, you've been in journalism for a long time, and so you know the power of it. You can really hurt people, and a lot of the time that's fine. But shouldn't news organizations be careful before training the bazooka on people much weaker than them? That's what bothers me here.
We are supposed to be the voice of the marginalized and the weak, and nothing fits that profile more than a 17-year-old high school student.
Yeah.
But Tucker, I think, as you alluded to early on, and Don Lemon's comment proves, this is all about Donald Trump. This is about that hat that the kid was wearing. And we have justified in the media anything that's against Trump is a positive. And the ends justify the means. Anything we can do to stop Trump because he may be an evil dictator, he may be this or that. It's such a exploitation and a misuse and a misunderstanding or just outright lying to the public. The president of the United States just doesn't have the power that we keep ascribing to him. The legislative branch, the judicial branch can limit the president. We have term limits. This isn't the next Joseph Stalin. This isn't Fidel Castro, who ruled for 30-some-odd years. This is a guy who can rule for 4 years, maybe, 8 years at the most, and then he's done. And he can only do what our legislative branch and our judicial branch allow him to do. It's crazy. We have been so dumbed down by social media. We don't even have a fundamental understanding of how our country operates.
That is such a smart point. But I mean, I always give people a pass on being mad at politicians because I think you have a right to give the finger to the people in power. And that is, as you noted, that is our job in the media, is to hold them accountable. And I actually believe that. But you would think somewhere along the line someone would say, okay, there's a difference between a politician, in this case Trump, and the people who voted for him. He has power, they don't. No one says that.
But also, I'm just sorry, the ends don't justify the means when you're a journalist. we're held to a higher standard. We've been having a conversation in America the last 10 years, 7 years about, hey, police, we got to hold them to a higher standard. They take an oath, blah, blah, blah. As journalists, we take an unstated oath about a search for truth and our duty to inform the public so they can make informed decisions. We are intentionally misleading the public. President Trump, President Obama, Bush, Reagan, all their powers are limited. And there's only so long they can hold power in this country. We're not Cuba. We're not the old Soviet Union.
No, that's right.
These evil dictators that they think are going to just take over, and Trump's going to just be this totalitarian that just runs this country down.
Okay, guys, thanks for watching. Let me ease us on out into the weekend with a nice song here.
Peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, and hath shed his own blood for my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to his cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well
Wow. Okay. Good to talk to you guys again. Take care. Have a good weekend.